Chapter 1291 2 Rituals Above the Grey Fog. In the ancient palace, Klein's figure appeared. At that moment, on the high-back chair belonging to the fool sat a person shrouded in grayish-white fog. As Klein returned to Sapphira Castle, this person instantly disintegrated, turning into transparent and distorted worms of spirit that flew to Klein and entered his body. Thankfully, the restrictions placed by 0-02 only involved no leaking of secrets or returning. I didn't have my connection with the worms of spirit that were guarding Sapphira Castle severed. Otherwise, they would have already lost control and become monsters. Klein sighed inwardly as he sat at the seat belonging to the fool and picked up the fool card he had previously sacrificed to himself. As the card of blasphemy had already been activated, there was no need for him to seek out any additional incantations. All he needed to do was inject spirituality into it to see the corresponding changes. The fool card quickly transformed into a miniature, illusory book. With Klein's guidance, it kept flipping back until it reached the last 2 pages. Sequence 1, Attendant of Mysteries. This is an angel who serves the profound mysteries. He has gained initial control of the corresponding domain's authorities. He can summon spirit body threads of objects that originally existed. He can combine many physical objects or abstract concepts together. The potion formula is as follows. Main ingredients: 1 Attendant of Mysteries Beyond characteristic. Supplementary ingredients: 9 Spirit World Specialties. Advancement Ritual: build a town consisting only of marionettes, and design a trajectory of fate for every marionette. By letting them interact with each other, they would act as a sufficiently real-life painting and create a corresponding area in the spirit world. The larger the town, the more the marionettes involved, the more detailed the daily lives are, and the more realistic and extensiveness the different fates are, the better the ritual's effects would be. Sequence 0, the Fool. This is a true deity. In a sense, he is an embodiment of the corresponding authorities. He is adept at using all kinds of methods to fool all things, showcasing all kinds of fascinating miracles. The potion formula is as follows. Main ingredients: the uniqueness of the fool. 2 Attendant of Mysteries Beyond characteristics apart from one's characteristic. Supplementary ingredients: control at least a quarter of the fog of history. Advancement Ritual: fool time, history, or fate once. As he read, Klein slowly frowned and silently muttered to himself. Compared to the advancement ritual of Attendant of Mysteries, the fool's ritual is just too abstract. What does it mean to fool time, history, or fate? How does one decide if it's successful? Controlling at least a quarter of the fog of history is relatively simple for me. On the one hand, I know a lot of ancient secrets and have lit up many historical fragments. On the other hand, I can directly influence the fog of history through Sapphira Castle. I'll put the fool's matter aside for now. Currently, my focus is on Attendant of Mysteries. You have to walk one step at a time before running is possible. Of course, some lucky ones can fly directly. It's very easy to find the 9 specialties in the spirit world. Be it to get Miss Messenger to help, or to seek the 7 Lights' advice, this isn't a problem. The advancement ritual is very close to the environment around Zeradol and the Antigonus family's ancestor. Furthermore, it matches what the 7 Lights said about having a close connection with the spirit world. I can determine it to be true for now. With this in mind, Klein took off the topaz pendant wrapped around his left wrist and used divination to confirm the authenticity of the Attendant of Mysteries potion formula. It wasn't that he didn't believe in Emperor Roselle, but his fellow countrymen had likely been influenced by Mr. Dorr before he created the cards of blasphemy. He had gone to the moon and suffered the corruption and contamination of the mother goddess of depravity, thus, resulting in distorted memories. It was precisely because of this that it was highly possible that Roselle had buried some traps in the key areas of the cards of blasphemy in his final days. In this aspect, Klein had always been cautious and careful. Speaking of the primordial moon's true form, the most powerful Great Old One, the mother goddess of depravity, could it be that the emperor had unknowingly been tainted based on her title? On the moon, perhaps there are many younger brothers and sisters that Bernadette has never met before. Of course, it's unlikely that there are gender differences. The marionettes needed for the Attendant of Mysteries ritual can be obtained from the forsaken land of the gods. The copious number of monsters there is a good thing. Furthermore, I've accumulated quite a few of them previously. As Klein's thoughts wandered, he turned his head to look at the other side of the ancient palace and made the grayish-white fog beside the junk pile dissipate. As the fog receded, rows of brownish-yellow seats appeared, each of which sat a figure. Those figures were either giants covered in silver armor, humans with deformed facial features in linen clothes, and large chunks of flesh overgrown with eyes. They sat quietly in their rows of seats, their eyes glazed over and indifferent as they stared in the direction of the long model table. These were all marionettes that Klein had gathered in the forsaken land of the gods. Every time he needed to switch location, and it wasn't convenient for him to carry too many with him, he would sacrifice a batch of them above the gray fog. Of course, this had nothing to do with environmental protection. Instead, it was what had happened to the foggy town and the scene displayed by Zeradal. It made Klein instinctively believe that there was a high chance that a particular ritual would require many marionettes. Therefore, he had always been very frugal in this aspect. As for why he didn't hang these marionettes up, and had made them sit in rows in a conjured theater as members of the audience, this was because Klein felt that the actions of the Antigonus family's ancestor and Zeradal were a little perverse. He had tried to imitate and mimic them, but the goal was for acting. Now, he didn't need it anymore. But how can such a marionette city produce corresponding spirit world information? The spirit world is a gathering of the past, present, and future information, but it doesn't directly include such fake objects. Generated from what others know. Every living being's actions and words would be reflected in the spirit world in an abstract manner, becoming the source of divination. When their actions, words, and certain intense feelings are clearly built into a marionette city, the city's spirit world projection would appear, turning into a true existence. The interactions involved in this are linked to the more profound secrets of the spirit world. Klein closed the Fool card in thought and played with it. As he had already reached the angel level, he had a certain understanding regarding the creation of the cards of blasphemy. Back then, not only was Roselle able to draw powers from knowledge, but he could also give actual powers to abstract knowledge. As for what kind of material the Emperor used to create it, and how he accomplished the effects of anti-divination and anti-prophecy at the level of deities, Klein was unable to figure it out. After some thought, Klein tried to accommodate the Fool card in his body. His condition immediately changed. His body was covered with colorful clothes, and there was an extremely gorgeous piece of headwear on his head. His aura was deep and terrifying, but it gave off a comical, ridiculous, ludicrous feeling. It was a condition filled with a strange conflict. The space attached to Sapphira Castle gently swayed, as though it wanted to surrender to the feet of this indescribable deity. My level has been enhanced a little. There aren't any substantial changes. After all, I'm already the owner of Sapphira Castle. It's like I have a fashionable costume that can accentuate my aura. Klein shook his head and said a few self-deprecating words. At the same time, a transparent and distorted worm of spirit crawled out from his body, forming a figure that was identical to him. After splitting off a worm of spirit of himself that could respond to prayers at any moment, Klein returned to the real world and strolled around Belton City. He used the method of granting wishes to treat the injuries of people, and he learned about the war from them. Dogs hit. Danitz couldn't help but curse when he heard the crew's report. They actually finished the whale oil? Why didn't you stop them? As they passed by the Gargas archipelago, Danitz and his crew bought a batch of whale oil that hadn't been refined. They planned on bringing it back to Biyao and selling it at a high price. Who would have expected that a portion of it had been secretly eaten by the City of Silver's half-giants? The crew member glanced at the oracle and whispered, "They don't understand what we're talking about." "We don't understand what they're talking about either. Only the shortest one can communicate, but it doesn't mean we can find him at any time. He always cogitates in places where the sun shines, changing positions every time." Danitz subconsciously sneered. This is what happens to illiterates. If you could grasp all sorts of languages like ancient Faesak, Jotun, and Elvish like me, something like that wouldn't have happened. Of course, linguistic talent is related to intelligence. You don't have to force yourself. The crewman carefully looked at Danitz again. Oracle, they ate the portion of whale oil you bought, dogs hit. Danitz's reaction was faster than his thoughts as he rushed towards the cabin. After a period of chaos, Danitz received compensation with a sequence 8 Beyonder characteristic. He didn't know if he had profited or suffered a loss. After all, the dirty bodily fluids left on the characteristic made him feel disgusted and nauseous. By the time the ship returned to peace, City of Generosity, Biyao, was already in front of the City of Silver's reconnaissance team. Derek led Lievel, Candace, and the others to the deck and looked at the destination of their journey. Although they had passed by many ports, they had never been allowed to alight from the ship. They could only watch from afar. Now, it was finally time for them to step onto the land outside. Even so, the large number of people, houses, and hardships that they had seen from afar were still unable to conceal their bubbling enthusiasm. They continued to yearn for life in the world of light. Of course, having been used to the darkness and lightning, they took quite some time before they could get used to the sun outside. If not for the fact that they were Beyonders, they would have suffered permanent damage to their eyes. As he looked at the docks and the numerous people, the airships that were traveling high in the sky, and the other ships around him while hearing noises that he could barely understand, Derek suddenly felt a sense of nervousness. This would be the area where the City of Silver would take up residence in the future. As he swept his gaze, he suddenly saw a man standing on the coastal lighthouse. He was wearing a long robe embroidered with the symbol of storm. His hair was dark blue, nearly black, like a clump of seaweed. His face was rough and carved. As their gazes met, Derek instantly calmed down and no longer felt uneasy. Chapter 1292. Entering Biyao for the first time after the huge ship belonging to the Resistance docked, all of the City of Silver citizens changed into round-neck shirts, brown jackets, pantaloons, and dark-colored caps before following Oracle Danitz down the ship. They prepared to pass through the dock to enter the City of Generosity Biyao. Those clothes had been prepared beforehand. It's really uncomfortable wearing this. It's not suitable for battle. As he walked, Lievel moved his limbs and whispered to Elder Derek. Derek nodded slightly and said, "But it's better to hide ourselves and not be too eye-catching. We don't want to become the focus of attention." Derek's analysis wasn't a problem at all. After all, they were outsiders and they only numbered 21 people. It was best if they didn't attract the attention of others, but he seemed to have forgotten a crucial detail. But, they're all looking at us. Candace quickly surveyed the area and whispered. The workers who were dressed crudely or half-naked at the pier all looked over at the tourists who wore all kinds of get-ups. They're tall. A Biyao resident with bronze skin and slightly curly hair could not help but sigh. His height was only around 160. This was the height of all the male commoners in the current colonial era. As for the people of the City of Silver, other than Derek, who was only slightly over 2 meters tall, the rest were on average above 2.3 meters. The tallest of them exceeded 2.5 meters. To have such half-giants walk through the docks amidst the crowd was equally eye-catching no matter what they wore. Phasations? A Loanese in a top hat and formal suit turned his head to gossip with his companion. Has the slave trade begun again? He believed that the City of Silver entourage were Phasation slaves that the Rorsted government had bought from the Lone Kingdom. After all, in this world, the only ones he could think of who had such heights in such numbers were the barbarians who claimed to be descendants of giants. His partner shook his head and frowned. It doesn't seem like the case. Most Phasations have light blue eyes. Furthermore, even if they are Phasation, few of them exceed 2 meters in height. Unless these are nobles or high-ranking prisoners of war, although Phasak didn't have a clear rule, in all kinds of industries, especially in the military, there was a phenomenon that one's height determined one's status. Of course, this wasn't the only condition. It was also a combination of family background, nobility, and ranks. Due to such traditions, the descendants of Phaeacian royalty and the military brass were generally taller than 2 meters. This was actually a superficial phenomenon that, at its essence, was an influence of their Beyonder characteristics. Those who became one of the brass of the Phaeacian military were either nobles or at least sequence 5. And for the latter, due to the repeated influence of the giant pathways potions, their height would definitely reach the standard height. Those who chose the Red Priest pathway would also have a certain increase in height. However, the signs weren't as obvious in their early stages as those from the giant pathway, and the total increase in height was only a few centimeters. They had to become a demigod to experience a qualitative change. For noble descendants, their ancestors were more or less giants, or had marital alliances with giants. Regardless of whether they inherited the Beyonder characteristics, the corresponding genes accumulated over generations would definitely allow their normal height to exceed 2 meters. Among them, families who were still in control of a portion of the giant pathways potion formulas, and those who had a certain heritage, tend to be in the same situation as the residents of the City of Silver. The royal family in charge of the Red Priest pathway maintained the heights of their descendants through marital alliances. The residents of the City of Silver, who were being scrutinized by numerous gazes, felt increasingly uneasy. It was as if they had returned to the cursed land where they were being watched by monsters as they walked in the dark. Derek was very calm and composed. He looked around and said to the members of the reconnaissance team, "They don't have any ill intentions." After confirming that Mr. Hanged Man was in this city and how he knew that he had arrived, Derek no longer felt isolated and helpless. It wasn't that he didn't trust the messenger that Mr. Fool had appointed, but that he believed that he didn't want to trouble a god as much as possible in his daily life. The best thing to do was resolve problems himself. And when it came to dealing with his own problems, Derek was ultimately unfamiliar with the outside world, so he wasn't too confident. At this moment, to have an experienced, trustable, extremely intelligent native with a meticulous mind help him would definitely be the best option. Of course, Derek also knew that Mr. Hanged Man wouldn't make any contact with him on the surface because he belonged to another faction. He wasn't a believer of Sea God, so if he acted too warmly over matters regarding the City of Silver, he was bound to be suspected. However, there will always be a proper reason and suitable opportunities to meet. Derek thought in anticipation. Amidst his thoughts, he and the members of the City of Silver's reconnaissance team followed Danitz out of the dock and arrived on the streets. Their vision suddenly broadened as they saw more people than before and heard all sorts of voices. To the people of the City of Silver, this was even more lively than the grandest harvest in their hometown. At a glance, there were countless people dressed in strange clothes with all kinds of unique characteristics. Some were in a hurry, others were strolling leisurely, and some were carrying large pieces of fruit. They used pipes to suck in the liquid, or held food that looked like the delicious pies on the ship, occasionally taking a bite. Apart from these, horse-like creatures that pulled carriages producing tinkling sounds, the metallic objects that moved extremely fast, and the smell of the various spices that filled the streets made people of the City of Silver feel like they had come to another world. And to them, this was indeed another world. Even though they were a little fearful and uneasy, and were not too used to such a scene, everyone could clearly feel the vibrancy of this scene. This was like the sunlight in one's soul, reflecting the sun in the sky. This is the place where we will live, battle, and reproduce in the future? Derek, Lievel, Candace, and the others subconsciously had similar thoughts. They felt a little uneasy but didn't reject any of it. Danitz looked at their faces which had been stunned silly by Biyam's bustling scene in satisfaction as he inwardly muttered, "This is only Biyam. If you were to go to Trier and Backlund, are you going to kneel down and kiss the ground?" This world-famous pirate controlled his urge to mock them, as he was now Mr. Fool's messenger. He couldn't ruin the image of a deity. After leading the City of Silver people to a rather luxurious hotel, Danitz gestured for the crew to handle the check-in as he spoke in fluent Jotun to his guests. "It's getting dark. We'll stay here for one night and leave the city tomorrow. The place where you will build your city has been arranged. It's on the other side of the forest. There's a natural harbor and a few roads that lead to Biyam." "Heh, roads to this city. After that, we'll expand the main road and build a railway that leads to your city. Railway. Derek, who had studied during the tarot gathering, knew what it meant. He nodded gratefully and inwardly praised Mr. Fool once again. Danitz continued, we've already helped you level the area, and left the space needed for some basic facilities such as water pipes and gas pipes. When you begin building houses, we'll send a team over to help with the matters. Also, the corresponding construction materials and temporary tents have been prepared for you. Thank Mr. Fool. There's also the help of the Church of the Lord of Storms in this matter. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to purchase so much material. However, they mainly did so to earn additional funds. The Rorsted new government hadn't been established for long, and its connections with the outside world weren't comprehensive enough. What they didn't expect was that the Church of the Lord of Storms had taken the initiative to provide help on the City of Silver's matter. Water pipes. Gas pipes. Derek gradually couldn't understand what was being said, but he still put on a pensive expression. There were a few times when Danitz nearly said the word dog's hit in passing. Without speaking another word, he introduced the hotel. This is a hotel that Phasacians like to live in at Biyao the most. The ceiling might be a little too low for you, but it won't be low enough to hit your heads. With that said, Danitz smiled. At the end of this street is Red Theater. He revealed a smile that all men understood. However, the people of the City of Silver didn't understand. Seriously, the Emperor said that the most ancient human occupation is the selling of their bodies. They actually don't know what I'm talking about. The corners of Danitz's mouth twitched as he gave up on the topic. After his second and third mates were done with the check-in, he led the entourage up to the second floor and assigned them their rooms. After doing this, he took out a stack of cards that he had long written, and he distributed them to the members of the City of Silver, who were scouting the area. Every card has a few words in the local language and the corresponding word in Jotun. If you need any services or food, you can ring the bell here. When the attendant comes over, show him the card. Of course, they might not be able to understand it, but they will definitely seek help from people who understand it. This was a simple and easy method to understand. The people of the City of Silver easily grasped how to use the cards, secretly excited that they could finally communicate with the people here. Following that, Danitz demonstrated how to switch on the water and how to use the toilet, and how to light up the gas wall lamps. It made Derek, Lievel, and Candace feel like they had arrived at a divine kingdom. All it took to have water flow was to press a switch. A button was enough to wash away their excrement without leaving any stains. There was a lantern that kept emitting light once it was ignited. These were all things that they didn't dare to imagine in the past. And these things would become part of their new lives. By the time the City of Silver's members had gotten used to the hotel, the sky had completely darkened. Night had begun to rule the city. Although Derek and company had long confirmed that there was no danger of monsters attacking in the dark in the outside world, they were still instinctively afraid. Therefore, they would either emit light themselves or light up the gas wall lamps. At that moment, they saw gas lamps lighting up one after another on the streets, the houses, both near and far, outside the glass windows. These lights dispersed the darkness in their respective areas. In the eyes of the people of the City of Silver, the bright and dim lights were like the galaxy landing on the ground at night. Chapter 1293 Devil's Oil Painting in a warehouse that was being rebuilt in Pritz Harbor. Furs met her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, once again a few days later. Are you ready? Dorian asked in a low voice. Back when they met, he had already informed Furs of the ritual requirement of the Apprentice Pathways Sequence for Secret Sorcerer, so that she could make advanced preparations. More or less. I should be able to satisfy the requirements, Furs replied without much confidence. The advancement ritual of a secret sorcerer was relatively simple, but in this case, simple was the antonym for complex and not difficult. To Furs, she wished that it was something else. The ritual required the candidate to seal a demigod-level creature with clear animosity. The less external help one received, the better the ritual's effects. As for the target's level, as long as it wasn't lower than a demigod, it was fine. It had virtually no effect on the ritual. Upon hearing that, Dorian nodded and said, "That should be fine. That ritual is really difficult for a Sequence 5 Beyonder to complete it on their own. It's necessary to seek help at appropriate times, but you mustn't go overboard, such as exceeding the corresponding limitations. Otherwise, the ritual will definitely fail." The suggestion he had previously provided to Furs was to borrow a Grade 1 sealed artifact. It would be best if she didn't even hire a saint-level helper. Furs said vaguely, "I only plan on making a wish to Mr. Fool to increase the success rate of advancement after consuming the potion. This is closer to obtaining good luck when consuming the potion, rather than being blessed and protected while sealing the demigod creature. Other than that, I'll be using the painting that you mentioned." The painting wasn't a Grade 0 sealed artifact, the Scroll of God, but the Abraham family's Grade 1 sealed artifact. It was called Devil's Oil Painting. In the fourth epoch, when many members of the Abraham family had advanced to Sequence 4 Secret Sorcerer, they had created the oil painting to seal the corresponding demigod-level creatures. However, after being attacked by the Aurora Order and losing a lot of documents, Dorian Gray wasn't sure how many terrifying creatures were sealed in the Devil's Oil Painting. He was only certain that there was definitely more than one sealed inside. His original plan was to release a demigod-level creature that was completely insane from the Devil's Oil Painting, one that acted purely out of instinct. This could then be his student's ritual target. This made it much easier than dealing with a rational and intelligent saint. Furthermore, it was completely in line with the ritual's requirements, but he never expected Furs to directly borrow the Devil's Oil Painting. Dorian frowned and reminded her, "The Devil's Oil Painting only has the effect of imprisonment and sealing. It doesn't have the ability to actively affect the target. In other words, you have to stuff a demigod-level creature into the Devil's Oil Painting." Furs nodded, indicating that she knew this. "Teacher, you mentioned that one's record ability isn't considered external help." "Yes," Dorian Gray gave a definite answer. If her record powers were considered external help, almost no traveler could advance. After all, record was the core ability of the apprentice pathway before they became demigods. Once it was excluded, Furs would be left only with the means to flee, making it difficult for her to do anything to her enemies. In theory, that's the case. However, you can only record at most 5 demigod-level powers, Dorian said worriedly. Before he finished his sentence, he thought of Mr. Fool and his blessed and felt a little more at ease. If the powers are matched well, it isn't impossible for me to succeed. It's just a mad creature that's acting on instinct. Furs tried convincing both her teacher and herself. Dorian nodded indiscernibly and didn't say anything else. He immediately summoned his contracted creature, Malmouth, who loved music, and took out the Secret Sorcerer main and supplementary ingredients. He then concocted a bottle of Secret Sorcerer potion for his student. If there's no way to complete the seal, there's no need to forcefully consume it. Even if the potion and glass bottle fuses together and turns into a sealed artifact, we can also pray to Mr. Fool to restore it to a Beyonder characteristic. Dorian continued to warn her worriedly before handing the potion to Furs. Inside the glass bottle were layers of stellar radiance, as though the Milky Way in the sky had been sucked into the potion. "All right." Furs nodded heavily, indicating that she wasn't worried that the potion would be wasted. She had made plans ahead of time. She would immediately teleport away once she realized she couldn't seal the released demigod-level creature before making a wish to Mr. Fool and getting him to resolve it. Dorian then took out an oil painting from his suitcase, which was filled with abstract images. It was an image that no one could understand. Just looking at it would make one feel dizzy and mentally weak. This was the Devil's Oil Painting that had sealed countless terrifying creatures. "If you can successfully advance, I only have one request." Dorian held the Devil's Oil Painting and said solemnly to Furs, "That is, on the night of the full moon, listen to what Mr. Dorr is saying and ask him the reasons for his actions." The members of the Abraham family still couldn't fully accept that the curse they had suffered from had stemmed from their ancestor. They felt that Mr. Dorr might not know the consequences of his plea for help. They wished to figure out the full truth. All right. Faced with her teacher's sincere request, Furs agreed without any hesitation. Following that, she took the devil's oil painting, teleported out of Pritz Harbor, and came to a vast desert where no humans lived. This way, even if an accident happened during the ritual, she had plenty of time to resolve it and not affect ordinary people. After checking the surroundings and preparing herself, Furs inserted the devil's oil painting into the ground. She then clasped her hands together and bowed her head to pray to Mr. Fool. She wished that he could increase her chances of advancing after consuming the potion. Without any pause, she saw the illusory grayish-white fog and knew that Mr. Fool had already responded. After stalling for a few seconds, Furs finally convinced herself. She took out the herbal powder she had prepared, and she scattered it on the devil's oil painting. Then, she recited the incantation to release the seal in Jotun. This was an incantation that only released one creature. Without a sound, the powder that was floating in the air landed on the oil painting and rapidly spun around a central point. As it spun, the surface of the oil painting turned illusory as if a deep vortex was forming. Suddenly, a bluish-black hand emerged from the vortex, one that showed signs of decay. It stretched out from the oil painting to the outside world. Furs's body suddenly turned cold as though she had fallen into a frozen lake. While clearing up her mind, it also made her seem to lose control of her body. No matter how hard she tried, she was unable to move her limbs. At that moment, Furs seemed to return to her past state of writing books at night and sleeping during the day. At that time, she often felt that she had woken up, but she couldn't move at all. It was as though she was being pressed down by an invisible creature. Although the terrifying creature in the devil's oil painting had yet to fully escape, its influence on the outside world with its godhood made Furs lose most of her ability to resist. Once it fully escapes from the oil painting, Furs would even lose control merely from looking at it directly. The difference between the two in their lives' natural order was unimaginable in certain aspects. Gradually, Furs's consciousness blurred a little, having a nagging feeling that she was already lucid. She raised her arm and moved her feet, but on second thought, she realized that it was only her imagination. As her body turned colder, the feeling of being pressed down by an invisible creature became more obvious. Fortunately, she had a bunch of demigods providing her information, allowing her to close her eyes in time. She didn't look at the devil's oil painting, otherwise, the consequences would be dire. Using cogitation to maintain a certain level of clarity, Furs began counting down. According to Mr. World's warning, she knew that the terrifying creature would need 5 seconds to completely escape the devil's oil painting. 4. 3. 2. With just 1 second left, an illusory book appeared in Furs's eyes. It quickly flipped and stopped on one page. 1. Just as Furs finished counting, she suddenly spread open her arms. Around her, peach blossoms fell in a colorful resplendence. The bluish-black hand that was about to grab her neck moved away from her and was blocked by the peach forest that was blooming with vegetation and flowers. It was separated by a mountain that was the forest's river source, making it only possible for it to enter through a small cave. This was a fairy tale magic Furs had recorded from Mam Hermit. It was called Peach Blossom Source. It could create an isolation barrier from the outside world, making it very difficult for the outside world to connect to it. Seizing this opportunity, Furs, who barely managed to regain control of her body, took out a queen chess piece from Roselle's chest from a pocket and threw it at the source of the peach blossom scene, throwing it at the cave that penetrated through the flowing river. This was another fairy tale magic she had recorded, called the chessboard of time. Its effect was to slow the target's movements, as though it had entered a region in which time flowed slower. With a smack, the actions of the bluish-black palm that was trying hard to break through the peach blossom source changed from extending outwards to squirming. Furs didn't even look at the effects. She used an invisible hand to pick up the devil's oil painting that was stuck in the sand, and she held it right up to the cave. After 1 or 2 seconds, the bluish-black palm returned to normal. Its movements became extremely fast as it charged out of the peach blossom source and crashed into the oil painting. As the oil painting shook, the terrifying creature penetrated the surface and landed in it. Furs was delighted. Without any hesitation, she recited the incantation and closed the outer seal of the devil's oil painting. Thankfully, that demigod creature has already lost control. It's left with nothing but madness and lacks intelligence. I wonder if I will directly hear Mr. Door's shouts after consuming the potion. Still nervous, Furs took out the secret sorcerer potion bottle and poured it into her mouth. Chapter 1294 Conversation. If that demigod creature didn't slam into the devil's oil painting on its own accord, I'd have to summon Mr. World's historical void projection. I wonder if that can be considered as directly hiring a helper at the angel level. As Furs pondered, she drank the potion. To her, the potion was like icy water that could hurt someone due to the extreme temperature. All her senses vanished in the areas that it passed, leaving only her still thoughts. It was inevitable that a person would hallucinate in extreme cold temperatures. In Furs's vision, a night sky instantly appeared. It was dotted with countless stars that weaved together to form a dreamlike river. Furs's body began reflecting bits of stellar radiance as if they came from her own body. The tiny bits of pure stellar radiance formed an invisible connection with the different stars in the night sky. As the light shimmered, they twisted and squirmed as insect-like creatures crawled out of Furs's body. They wanted to seek refuge in the Milky Way formed by an array of embedded diamond shards. Each of them carried a portion of their own flesh and consciousness, as though they were uncontrollable avatars. Furs's thoughts quickly turned chaotic, and she fell into confusion. She almost couldn't control the urge to separate herself. At that moment, she sensed an illusory object. It was the seal that she had completed using the devil's oil painting. It was projected into the mysterious world created by the potion, forming an abstract, blurry mark. Furs didn't think further as she instinctively extended a portion of her consciousness along with her spirituality, and intertwined with the abstract symbol. The mark wasn't exactly harmonious with her, as if it wasn't part of her, but it managed to barely merge with her. Suddenly, in Furs's mind, the abstract symbol became rather clear. It consisted of a door that was layered with mysterious symbols. This door hid Furs behind it, allowing her to isolate herself from the surrounding cosmos. At the same time, on the other side of the door, the sealed creature seemed to sense the aura of an enemy. Using its own godhood, it wildly corroded the illusory door. It happened to be able to reduce the influence the cosmos had on Furs. After maintaining it for more than 10 seconds, the resplendent Milky Way's night sky slowly faded away. The stellar radiance then returned to Furs's body fused with her. At this moment, a deep darkness appeared in front of Furs. Deep in the darkness was a perpetual storm and occasionally flashing lightning. The next second, Furs heard a familiar voice. It stabbed into her head like steel nails, stirring her brain matter. Furs grimaced immediately. If she hadn't experienced such things over and over in the past, and had some level of resistance, as well as the fact that she was at the saint level, she would have likely lost control. Of course, there had to be some influence of good luck here. After a few seconds, she finally managed to calm herself down and hear what the voice was shouting by using cogitation. It was calling for help. It wasn't Jotun, Elvish or ancient Hermes. Instead, it was a language that Furs had never come into contact with before. However, she could understand it the moment she heard it. She felt like it was the true source of many languages. Mr. Door would crazily shout for help every full moon. How disgraceful of a king of angels. However, even if he is seeking help, it's still a terrifying thing that I can't withstand. Furs lampooned silently. She was considering if she should pretend not to hear it and wait until she had converged her spirituality and grasped the beyonder powers of a secret sorcerer before conversing with Mr. Door during the next full moon, or to do it now. Suddenly, the shouts from afar stopped and the surroundings became deathly silent. After 2 to 3 seconds, a wispy voice that could pierce through spirit bodies entered Furs's mind. You used the beyonder characteristics of the Abraham family. This sentence was said in a flat manner without any rise or fall, but it made the blood vessels on Furs's forehead throb. Her eyes turned bloodshot as her body turned resplendent. She almost lost control of herself. "Who are you?" Furs composed herself and asked deliberately. The voice that seemed to lure her into losing control said in a low, smiling voice, "You can call me Mr. Door. You should be familiar with me." The King of Angels from the fourth epoch directly pointed out that Furs had a certain connection with him. She could hear the full moon ravings. "I'm going to write you into a novel." Furs secretly gritted her teeth and asked, "Honorable Mr. Door, are you the ancestor of the Abraham family, Your Excellency Bethel?" The voice that had crossed countless barriers returned to its flatness. "Yes." "Then, do you know that your cry for help has caused the entire Abraham family to be trapped in a curse that has lasted for more than 1,000 years? It's basically impossible for anyone to become a traveler or even a scribe. They often lose control during advancements or the night of the full moon." Furs felt that she couldn't speak to Mr. Door for a long time, otherwise, her inclination towards losing control would be irreversible. She directly posed the question that the Abrahams were most concerned about. Mr. Door fell silent for 2 seconds before saying, "They no longer have secret sorcerer or demigods. There aren't any after the War of the Four Emperors. And the curse you brought has made it impossible for them to advance to a demigod. If you can stop crying for help for 10 years, a new Abraham demigod might be born. This will greatly aid in your escape," Furs sincerely suggested. Mr. Door sighed and said, "I have been exiled to an eternal darkness, and suffer the blockage of a perpetual storm. I have no way to know what's happening in the real world, nor did I expect that there isn't a single demigod left in the entire Abraham family." Lies. The one who calmly made this conclusion wasn't Furs, but rather Klein, who had accommodated the fool's card as he held the staff of the stars while sitting in Sapphira Castle. He had been closely monitoring the corresponding crimson star. He remembered that the Emperor had mentioned in his diary that Mr. Door had a certain understanding of reality. He seemed to be able to use the changes brought about by the full moon to see the situation outside the seal. After sighing, Mr. Door continued, "Besides, I can't control the cries for help during the full moon." "Why?" Furs asked in surprise. Mr. Door said in an ethereal voice, "You're already a demigod, so you should know very well that the higher the sequence, the greater the threat of going mad. An ordinary angel, even those who can walk the land freely and do what they like, without needing to engage in any additional battles, could also be gradually influenced by the Beyonder characteristics and become less like themselves. They might even enter a half-crazy state. I'm a king of angels who has been exiled and sealed for more than 1,000 years, and I don't even have someone to communicate with. My not going crazy means that I'm sufficiently powerful and lucky. On each full moon, the madness in me will be strengthened. I can't control it and can only constantly call for help. So that's how it is. If I were locked up like this, I might have gone crazy in a few months. If I'm provided alcohol, newspapers, magazines, all kinds of books, and various delicacies, I can last a year, no, half a year." Furs nodded in enlightenment and asked in a perfunctory manner, "Is there anything I can do for you? How can the Abrahams dispel the curse?" Mr. Door fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "Set up a ritual and help me escape. That way, the curse will cease to exist. There are 2 rituals that can be used. One is to sacrifice 3 demigods that are respectively from the seer, apprentice, and marauder pathway. The other is to extract the blood of at least 99 Beyonders from the Abraham family. Use it to draw such a symbol, I'll tell them," Furs immediately replied. At the same time, she added inwardly, "That's if Mr. Fool permits it." Mr. Door laughed and said, "If I can escape because of this, I will help you become an angel." His voice became more ethereal and weaker, as though he was slowly returning to his original state as Furs' advancement came to an end. About 2 to 3 seconds later, Furs couldn't hear the sounds that slowly pushed her onto the path of losing control. The deep darkness and horrifying storms in front of her also vanished. However, before the scene completely faded away, Furs could vaguely see that, on a vast land formed from dark red rocks, there was an ancient building that resembled a pyramid erected there. Behind the building was a deep darkness and twinkling stars. It was completely different from the cosmos that she had seen as an astrologer on the ground. What's this? Furs shook her head and controlled her scattered thoughts as she began to carefully rein her spirituality back. After getting accustomed to the state of a secret sorcerer, she immediately took on a praying posture and reported her previous experiences to Mr. Fool without missing anything. After doing this, Furs put away the devil's oil painting, teleported back to Pritz Harbor, and met her teacher, Dorian Gray Abraham, who was waiting in the warehouse. Seeing that his student was safe and sound, Dorian heaved a sigh of relief and said in a pious manner, "Thanks to Mr. Fool for his blessings." He had finally taught a sequence 4 secret sorcerer who didn't show signs of betrayal. Due to Mr. Fool's lack of response, Furs didn't inform her teacher of her conversation with Mr. Dor. She planned on waiting until the next full moon. She also relaxed and smiled. "Apart from thanking Mr. Fool, I have to thank you, teacher." In the ancient palace above the fog, Klein didn't have any doubts about Mr. Dor calling himself half crazy. He only felt that there had to be more secrets hidden in the matter. For example, why did Mr. Dor keep enticing Emperor Roselle to visit the moon? It was a place that was occupied by an outer deity. After some thought, he took out the scarlet lunar corona and master key from the fog of history. He planned on creating a full moon environment and listening to Mr. Dor's shouting. The effects of the combination had long been confirmed. Klein quickly heard the voice that seemed to pierce through his spirit body. The content of the shouting was, "Don't save me. Don't save me." Chapter 1295 The Aftermath from the War's Frontlines, Don't Save Me. Don't Save Me. Being located in Sapphira Castle and having accommodated the Fool's card, Klein already had the status of a king of angels. He no longer suffered any direct corruption from Mr. Dor's cries, but the contents of the cries made his scalp tingle. His pupils dilated, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of horror surging in his heart. He originally believed that Mr. Dor was constantly shouting for help, but what he heard now was, "Don't save me." Amidst Klein's silence, the weak, wispy voice pierced through his spirit body like needles. After shouting for more than 10 seconds, it suddenly changed. "Help me. Help me." This time, there was a certain change in the language used. Klein expressionlessly leaned back into his chair and listened for nearly 10 seconds. Following that, he removed his control over the master key and the scarlet lunar corona's historical void projection, allowing the atmosphere of the space above the gray fog to completely return to silence. Phew. He exhaled as he tapped the edge of the long modeled table out of habit and muttered to himself, "Mr. Dor is indeed half mad, but the mad part isn't the him who is desperately screaming, but the him who appears calm, the one that's able to communicate with people rationally. The latter can influence the former to a certain extent, distorting the contents of his shouts. When Mr. Dor is lucid, he actually shouts, 'Don't save me.' To a king of angels who had been imprisoned for more than 1,000 years, this definitely isn't a normal reaction. Unless he feels that he will bring a disaster that he doesn't wish to see upon returning to reality. A king of angels that has completely lost control? Together with Mr. Dor's communication with the Emperor, and how he had been constantly enticing him to visit the moon, which is occupied by an outer deity. There is another possibility to this matter. Mr. Dor, who was exiled, lost the protection left behind by the original creator. He encountered the corruption of a particular outer deity and lost most of his rationality. His condition is only slightly better than the chained god. The apprentice pathway can wander the cosmos at sequence 3. Mr. Dor's honorific name also includes the title of Guide of the Endless Cosmos. Does this mean that before this king of angels was exiled, he might have already made contact with outer deities and came under some influence? Yes. What does Miss Magician's final glimpse of the Crimson Land, pyramid-like buildings, and cosmos in a different area represent? This doesn't seem like it's in the current solar system, but it's a little different from the mausoleum that a Black Emperor needs. It's the lair of some outer deity who affected Mr. Dor, or should I say that when Mr. Dor became a planeswalker and left legends behind on other planets with living beings, this is one of his anchor points? It's highly likely the latter, because when Miss Magician saw this scene, she didn't encounter any corruption from the cosmos. The more Klein thought about it, the heavier his heart became. This was because it was possible that this was a reflection of how the apocalypse would dawn. The apocalypse was definitely not something that wouldn't happen by not thinking about it or pretending not to know. It's no wonder Yellow Light Venathan had prophesied that the day when the curse is removed is the beginning of the true disaster for the Abrahams. Mr. Dorr keeps calling for help, causing the Abraham family to be unable to produce another demigod. Perhaps it's a certain form of protection. Although this will make the Abraham family lose their status and most precious items, making them mediocre, it can at least save their bloodline. In the prophecy, the solution to resolving the curse is in the hands of an apprentice who has obtained the help of a secret existence. Klein chuckled softly and had an idea about the response to give Miss Magician. He planned on getting Furs to give a half-truth when informing her teacher. Firstly, it was to emphasize that Mr. Dorr was already half-crazy and extremely dangerous. Even communicating with him implied tremendous risks. Secondly, it was to not mention the second ritual for the curse removal. All she would say was about the sacrificing of a seer, a marauder, and an apprentice demigod. With the first point, the Abrahams could understand why their ancestor was insistent on calling for help. This was because he had already lost his mind and could do all sorts of terrifying things. This could effectively eliminate the anxiety of the Abrahams, preventing them from helping Mr. Dorr escape, and allowing them to quickly start believing in the fool. The second point was to dispel the small number of extreme Abrahams who wanted to try their luck. This was because they lacked the ability to complete such a ritual. At the same time, informing the Abrahams of the ritual increased the trust they had in Furs. Ignoring the small number of secret sorcerers available, those who can become bizarro sorcerers are definitely very difficult to capture. Furthermore, most of them are concentrated in the secret order. To deal with them is to provoke Zeradal. Even if the Abrahams have a demigod, and can use a grade 0 sealed artifact for a short period of time, it's impossible for them to complete the ritual so easily. Yes, dealing with a parasite is the most dangerous. If they aren't careful, they might end up targeting Amon's avatar. When that happens, it will be equivalent to serving Amon desserts. Also, I'll use the world's Gehrman Sparrow in the future to remind Miss Magician to keep her guard up against the Abraham family's extremists. Klein thought for a moment before replying Furz's prayer. After returning from the fog of history to the real world, Klein boarded a steam locomotive and arrived at the capital of Mid-Seashire. In the past, it was the second largest city in Lone, and also the front line of the recent war, Constant City. The damage suffered here is very serious. After getting off the train and leaving the platform, Klein stood up high and looked at the industrial city. Although it was his first time here, he had seen all sorts of pictures of Constant in newspapers and magazines. Those photos were all black and white, and they recorded the various aspects of this city. Among them, there were 3 points that left a deep impression on Klein. Firstly, it was filled with chimneys and tall blast furnaces. It was as though it was a man-made forest. It gave a striking visual impact, one that was more representative of industry than Backlund. Secondly, the majority of the buildings used concrete and steel. They were more densely built than their counterparts in Backlund. Thirdly, there were many places that were stained with coal ashes, including the bodies of humans, but the air quality was better than Backlund because the sea breeze was strong. And now, the towering blast furnaces, chimneys, and tall buildings had become rather sparse. All that was left was a pile of ruins. However, in comparison, the damage dealt to the factory district was lesser than the residential areas. This was because there were many steel and military factories that were equally important to Fasak. The death toll here is definitely more than 100,000. Klein sighed inwardly. He carried his luggage and walked down the stairs to the steam locomotive station and entered Constant City. On the way to the hotel, he continued his acting as a miracle invoker and randomly chose a young, burly man in his 30s. I'm a wandering magician. My best magic trick is to grant anyone's wishes. Do you want to try it? The previously thin-skinned Klein was now able to strike up a conversation naturally. The burly man glanced at him and waved his hand impatiently. "Can you let my father, mother, 2 brothers, and a child be revived?" With that said, he didn't wait for the magician to respond as he walked towards the nearest public carriage station in a slightly irritable manner. He struck his left chest with his right fist. Klein stood where he was and maintained the smile on his lips as he quietly watched the man leave. He recalled a magazine he had read on a steam locomotive. It contained several pages of images reflecting the current state of each cemetery in Constant City. The tombstones were similar to the original chimneys and blast furnaces. The racks that held up urns of ashes resembled tall buildings that had collapsed. The entirety of Constant City seemed to be buried in a cemetery. Retracting his smile, Klein walked around the already dried-up fountain and walked to a nearby inn. Along the way, he heard many pedestrians discussing haunted places and the places with terrifying monsters. "When I was passing by the Maris River, I heard a lot of people crying in the water. I didn't dare to look and ran back into the city like the wind. That's nothing. I saw something even scarier on 9 Hyacinth Street. There was a face plastered on the window there. A very pale face. A few passers-by disappeared behind my house, and the blood continued all the way to the nearest ruin, but the police couldn't find the bodies. How terrifying. May the goddess bless us. Holy Lord of Storms. Let these ghosts and monsters stay away from us. By the way, City Hall has posted an announcement that we are to report it to the police the moment such things are discovered. From the looks of it, the meat grinder-like war made it impossible to placate many corpses, allowing them to turn into ghosts. Few, most of the time, some of the dead might not even have their bodies left intact. Yes, there are definitely many Beyonders who lost control due to a mental breakdown or from losing their limbs. Also, most of those who didn't consume the potion according to the normal procedures also easily lose control. The Nighthawks and mandated punishers will definitely clear up these matters, but at least in Constant City, people might have encountered plenty of Beyonder matters for quite a long period of time. After all, some ghosts and monsters are good at evasion and hiding. They are innately very cunning. Klein walked straight and gained a new understanding of Constant's situation. Here, encountering supernatural events was no longer a coincidence. Instead, it was a daily occurrence with a certain probability. At this moment, Klein saw a group of Nighthawks wearing red gloves and black trench coats walk across the crossroad ahead of him. However, he didn't recognize any of them. Indeed, the Cathedral of Serenity has sent the Red Gloves team to help. What's happening nearby? Klein nodded indiscernibly and, following his spiritual intuition, cast his gaze to a particular apartment building behind a pile of ruins. On the 4th floor, behind an oriel window, a greatly rotting face was plastered to the window, looking out through the glass. Pale yellow liquid with black hints slid down the window one after another. Chapter 1296. Amateur astronomer Eric had become a captain of a Red Gloves team during the later stages of the war, as well as advancing to Sequence 5 Spirit Warlock. He had witnessed the deaths of the ex-captain and ex-ex-captain. He knew that a higher sequence wasn't a guarantee that he would be safer. Care and caution was what mattered. To the elite Red Gloves of the Nighthawks, this was a concept that almost everyone believed in. This was because ordinary Nighthawks might only encounter ordinary problems that looked like supernatural events. Occasionally, there would be slip-ups, and it was highly likely that they would rely on their Beyonder powers to turn the situation around. As for Red Gloves who worked on various important cases, their hidden targets were definitely rather dangerous. At that moment, Eric stood on the 4th floor of the apartment on 14 Priya Street. Facing the tightly shut dark brown wooden door, he surveyed the area and said, "2 Nighthawks have already gone missing here. We must not be careless." Initially, several residents of this apartment block reported it to the police. They claimed that Unit 403 had a stench, and the tenants of Unit 303 often heard heavy footsteps from above. The policeman in charge of the area took 2 days before coming to investigate. However, they didn't walk out of Unit 403. After the police confirmed this, they immediately transferred the case to the Church of Evernight. However, the two Nighthawks who came to deal with it also disappeared. The door to Unit 403 remained tightly shut. Due to this premise, the Church of Evernight's Archbishop of the Mid-Seashire Diocese entrusted the matter to Eric's team and allowed them to apply for a Grade 1 sealed artifact as support. "Yes, Captain." The members of the Red Gloves team either nodded or spoke in response. Eric didn't say anything else as he stood in front of the dark brown door of Unit 403, which remained tightly shut. He raised his red-gloved left hand and knocked on one of his teeth. A blurry figure suddenly appeared in front of him. As though it had no substance to it, it passed through the gap in the door and entered Unit 403. Eric's expression was unusually focused, as if he was observing the situation in the room through that blurry figure. It was a natural spirit that he controlled. It wasn't especially powerful, but it had special abilities. It usually lived on his left front tooth. Under the current situation, Eric believed that they shouldn't barge in directly. It was best to do reconnaissance first. Even if his team had a good mix of powers and a powerful sealed artifact to help them, they had to be cautious. If he could figure out the situation inside and prepare for it in a targeted fashion, he believed that things would be much easier. Right at this moment, tiny blood vessels protruded in Eric's eyes, and some of them even exploded. When his vision turned bright red, Eric heard a heavy creak. The dark brown door suddenly opened. There were a total of 6 figures in the room. 3 police officers wore black and white uniforms. They were sitting on high-back chairs, high stools, and the sofa. 2 of them were wearing half-top hats, black trench coats, of which one was standing by the door, and the other was standing behind the oriel window. His face was pressed to the surface of the glass as if he was watching the streets downstairs. There was also a figure sitting on a high stool at the edge of the balcony. In front of him was an exquisite astronomical telescope. The skin of the 6 figures began to swell, as though they had been injected with gas. Some parts of the body had even cracked and were highly decomposed, but they still hadn't dried up. They exuded a bluish-black glisten as light yellow liquid with hints of black flowed out. Sensing the door open, the 6 figures turned to look at Eric and the others. The first was the Nighthawk standing in front of the door. The last was the man wearing a cotton shirt behind the astronomical telescope. He had one of his eyeballs, its blacks and whites separated clearly, glued to the telescope's lens, allowing him to only use his remaining black, empty socket to scan the Red Gloves team outside. A faint stench drilled into the noses of Eric and the others as an indescribable coldness filled the surroundings. Eric instinctively raised his hand to hit his teeth, releasing more spirits. Then, he used his Nightmare Beyonder powers to forcefully drag all his targets into a dream. However, no matter how he tapped his teeth, he didn't release his soul. His Spirit Warlock Beyonder powers seemed to have vanished instantly. At the same time, a nightmare in the Red Gloves team also discovered in surprise that he was unable to pull someone into a dream. At that moment, apart from the enhancement in their physique brought by the potion, their Beyonder powers mysteriously vanished. "Leave this place," Eric ordered without hesitation. He had never encountered such a strange situation before. All he could do was get the team to retreat first before choosing a sealed artifact to handle the situation in a targeted manner. However, he and his team members didn't move despite his orders. It was as though their bodies were no longer taking orders. Eric instinctively lowered his head and looked at his lower body. His legs were swollen and his pants were torn. In addition, he could clearly feel that his skin was decaying, rotting, and running with pus. He and his Red Gloves team had yet to truly come into contact with their target, but they had fallen into a nightmare of watching themselves die, swell, and rot bit by bit with no way to escape. Right at this moment, Eric's bloodshot eyes reflected a normal palm. He held the handle and gently pulled it. Thud. The dark brown door of Unit 403 closed once again, separating Eric and his Red Gloves team from the creatures in the room. They instantly regained control over their bodies. However, their legs seemed to have suffered significant injuries. It was a little difficult to move them, be it raising their feet or bending their knees. Eric didn't bother checking on his injuries. He quickly cast his gaze on the palm that closed the door, and its owner. It was a young man wearing an ancient hat and a long black robe. His facial features were ordinary, making it impossible for one to have a deep impression of him. It was a face that one forgot in seconds. I sincerely advise you to return now and leave the matter to the archbishop or high-ranking deacons to handle. Of course, you have another choice. That is to ask me to grant a wish. I'm a wandering magician named Merlin Hermes. My specialty is granting the wishes of others. Klein spared no effort in enticing others to make a wish. When he saw the rotting face on the oriel window earlier, he suddenly had an ominous feeling, so he specially came over to confirm what had happened. Grant wishes. Eric recalled the education he had received during his training in the Holy Cathedral. A high-sequence beyonder might be in a state of being imprisoned or sealed. They will pretend to be mystical items that can grant wishes, and they will entice you into helping them escape. The corresponding examples include granting 3 wishes and wishing pools. Is this a high-sequence beyonder? But he doesn't look like he's imprisoned or sealed. Eric looked left and right and deliberated for a few seconds before probing. If we don't ask you to grant us our wishes, will you not resolve the abnormality in the room? As soon as he finished speaking, he saw the wandering magician who called himself Merlin Hermes fall deep in thought, looking a little troubled. A few seconds later, Klein raised his hand to stroke his tall top hat. He smiled and sighed. Even if you don't make the wish, I will still attempt to resolve it. Do I need to read your honorific name or your true name to have my wish granted? Eric asked after exchanging glances with his team members. Klein shook his head. No, just tell me your wish. This wouldn't create a mysticism connection. Eric probed in a joking tone, then I wish the abnormalities in this room will be resolved and will no longer affect the surroundings. Klein curled his smile and gently clapped his hands. Your wish will come true. Without waiting for Eric to respond, he smiled and said, the abnormalities inside can suppress beyonder characteristics, causing the corresponding powers to be ineffective, but that isn't absolute. Typically in such cases, my suggestion is, as he spoke, Klein reached out with his left hand and took out an eyeball-shaped glass ball. He then twisted the handle with his right hand, opening the door a little. Then, through a crack, he threw the glass ball into Unit 403. As the glass ball flew, it constantly absorbed the surrounding light and gave off a brilliant, pure, extreme sunlight that resembled a miniature sun. The next second, Klein closed the door with his right palm, lest Eric and company's eyes couldn't take it. My suggestion is to use a Grade 1 sealed artifact in the sun domain to purify the entire area. While saying that, Klein recalled the mutated sun sacred emblem behind Tinjin City's Chinese gate. Although it was only a Grade 3 sealed artifact, it could still deal with the rotting creatures inside given enough time. Just as Eric was about to say that they had brought a similar sealed artifact, but just didn't have the chance to use it, he saw Mr. Merlin Hermes open the door to Unit 403. The 6 figures inside had vanished into thin air, and the different beyonder characteristics were slowly condensing. The originally cold and sinister stench had been completely melted by the warm feeling. It's been resolved? Eric asked after some hesitation. Klein shook his head with a smile. No, the root of the problem is still here. Have you investigated the owner of this place? Eric replied immediately. He calls himself John, an amateur astronomer. He likes to study the cosmos using specialized telescopes at night. Studying the cosmos. Klein walked into the room without batting an eyelid, and he casually instructed, search the area and find any possible clues. For some reason, Eric suddenly felt that Mr. Merlin Hermes was the captain from back when he first joined the Nighthawks. He was professional, calm, and trustworthy. He nodded at his team members, signaling them to follow his instructions. As for him, he continued following Klein. It was both to provide him help, and also for necessary precautions. Klein ignored him as he swept his gaze and approached the exquisite astronomical telescope. Then, he bent down and drew his eyes towards the lens. This might be dangerous. Eric had planned to warn him, but he fell silent when he thought about how high the other party's level and status expressed. At that moment, through the telescope, Klein saw a resplendent, dreamlike dark night sky. Every star there was blinking slightly. Suddenly, his vision was occupied by a huge eye. The eye seemed to be directly attached to the lens on the other end of the telescope. It was grayish-white with a pale yellow iris. Veins swelled outwards and seeped out disgusting translucent pus. Chapter 1297, Forest of Miracles Boom. The Red Gloves captain, Eric, shivered involuntarily as he saw Merlin Hermes, who claimed to be a wandering magician, explode behind the telescope. However, there was no splattering blood or flesh. The shredded limbs disappeared into the air like soap bubbles. Eric and his team members, who looked over due to the commotion, were stunned. They didn't understand the reason behind such a sudden sequence of events. A second later, Eric said in a deep voice, "Retreat." He wanted to evacuate his team before the danger truly spread. At this moment, another figure walked in from the open door of Unit 403. It was none other than Merlin Hermes, who had just exploded. This wandering magician was wearing a tall hat and a long black robe. As if nothing had happened, he spoke to Eric and his team members. "The root of the problem really is from that telescope." As he spoke, Klein walked to the balcony and tapped the telescope with his right hand. Another bang rang out as the telescope suddenly shattered into metallic points of light that emitted a foul stench of bluish-black gas. The moment the grayish-white fog appeared, the stench vanished and the room returned to normal. What exactly happened? Eric forced himself to forget about the other party's death and asked cautiously. As a captain of the Red Gloves who was rather experienced, he had some guesses about the truth of the matter. The main goal of asking was to seek confirmation. Klein smiled and said, "Simply put, the telescope mutated for some reason, causing the owner of the room to see something that he shouldn't have seen. If you want to understand more details, you can only search for clues yourself." "I'm not too sure either." Eric nodded slightly and cast his gaze at his team members, signaling them to continue their investigation. After a series of work, Eric said to Merlin Hermes, "There aren't many clues left in the room. We can only confirm a few things. 1. John is a local resident, and he served in the military during the war. It seems that he had some mental problems as a result. 2. He had been an amateur astronomer. At the end of the war, he joined an academic organization known as the Celestial Research Association, but we didn't obtain any information about this organization. 3. John was seeking the way to see the true cosmos." Upon mentioning the word cosmos, Eric paused slightly, as though he had received a warning from the upper echelons of the Church of Evernight. He joined an organization known as the Celestial Research Association after the war ended. Sought the way to see the true cosmos. Klein combined this knowledge with his experience and had a certain level of confidence in the matter. He nodded and said, "You should know that the cosmos means danger. You can't even try to understand it. We will report this case to the Archbishop as soon as possible and classify the Celestial Research Association as a dangerous organization," Eric said, as if speaking to a Nighthawk superior who wasn't directly in charge of him. Klein didn't respond as he walked to the door and sighed. Indeed, war really does have an irreversible impact on all aspects. After the fall of the god of combat, the already crumbling barrier set up by the Primordial One lost parts of its support. As for the Evernight goddess, she has yet to fully gain control of the corresponding uniquenesses. As for becoming a great old one, who knows how much longer that will take. Under such circumstances, the intrusion of the outer deities into this world would naturally deepen. This has combined with the damage that many ordinary people have suffered from the war. Klein suspected that, during the subsequent period of rebuilding after the war, many cults that pointed to the different outer deities or cosmos would appear secretly in lone. If he allowed them to spread their faith and attempt various risky attempts, the apocalypse would definitely be brought forward. As he sighed, he walked out of Unit 403. His figure blurred, turning transparent until he disappeared. In a hotel near Priya Street, Klein, who had long since moved in, picked up the coffee in front of him and took a sip. Taking advantage of the fact that it was still early, he went out once again and took a carriage to the outskirts of the coastal Constant City. There was a cemetery. The stone tablets stood erect like a short forest. Klein walked through the cemetery and found a tombstone with the help of his spirituality. The name on the tombstone wrote, Welch McGovern. This was the original Klein's university schoolmate. As he had bought the Antigonus family's notebook, he had mysteriously died in Tianjin. This had indirectly caused Zhou Mingrue to transmigrate. Welch McGovern's father was a banker in Constant City. He had spent money to bring his son's corpse back to his hometown and buried it in this cemetery. Klein stared at the photo on the tombstone for a few seconds. He bent down and placed the bouquet of white flowers in his hand in front of Welch's grave. Just as he was about to turn and leave, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. 20 to 30 seconds later, an old man with a black cane walked over from another direction. Klein recognized him and knew that he was Welch's father. He was the mid-seashore county banker who had once invited him and his schoolmates to a sumptuous meal. However, compared to a few years ago, this gentleman had aged significantly. He was originally a very energetic middle-aged gentleman, but now, his hair was half white. There were many wrinkles on his eyes, mouth, and forehead. Who are you? Welch's father looked at the stranger in front of the grave. He asked, puzzled and wary. Klein sighed and said, Mr. McGovern, I'm Welch's friend. I just happened to pass by Constant City recently. Welch's father nodded slightly and said in a deep voice, he's a very sociable person. I only know a number of his friends. His words were an attempt to explain why he hadn't invited Klein to the funeral and how sorry he was. Klein didn't say anything else as he looked around and said, Is there anything you need help with? Or do you have any wishes that you wish to have fulfilled? I hope I can provide you with some strength. Welch's father looked around and smiled bitterly. Can you allow all the dead here to stand up again? It's not impossible, but they will be different from what you have in mind. Klein sighed and shook his head. Then can you allow Constant to return to its original state? Welch's father asked with a bitter smile. Without waiting for Klein's reply, he sighed and continued, There's no need to provide any help. I can achieve what is possible myself. If it's impossible, then I can only pray to the deities. As he spoke, the banker went past Klein and walked to his son's tombstone. He bent down and put down the bouquet of white flowers. Klein looked at his back and muttered to himself, I will try my best. With that, he turned around and left the cemetery. Constant City, in a bar with a style that resembled the previous centuries. A man donning a thick jacket carried his beer and walked to a wooden board beside the bar counter. He tried to find a part-time job on the notices pasted on it. Suddenly, he saw a strange mission, I'm a reporter. I want to gather all kinds of stories from different people. It's best if you had personally experienced it yourself. The remuneration I can provide is to satisfy your wish to repair and rebuild your house for free. I have sufficient resources in this aspect. Merlin Hermes. The man subconsciously frowned. He felt that this request was too strange, like it was a prank. Can you read the words on it? A thin man who was sitting beside the wooden board took the opportunity to ask. Few patrons of this bar were literate. Even if they wanted to find a job, or accept the corresponding commissions, most people were unable to understand the notices on the wooden board, and the bartender could only remember the few with the highest pay. As a result of this situation, the thin, feeble man relied on the common Loanese terms he learned at the free schools to provide the corresponding interpretation at a quarterpence. This was how he made a living. The man shook his head, indicating that he understood Loanese. He pointed at Merlin Hermes' request and said, Is this real? It is. That reporter is sitting by that corner, the one wearing a very tall hat. The thin, feeble man enthusiastically pointed him in the correct direction. The reporter had promised him a quarterpence for every person he introduced. The man holding the beer fell silent. After hesitating for a full 10 seconds, he walked to the corner and found the reporter named Merlin Hermes. Will you really help me rebuild my house? He asked worriedly. Klein pointed at the documents on the small round table and said, "We can sign a contract." "There's no need. Even if you provide some materials, I'll still be very satisfied." The man sat opposite Klein and said rather cautiously, "I don't have a very touching story. As long as it's real enough." Klein nodded slightly in encouragement. The man looked down and stared at the table. "I'm a constant native, and I used to have a decent job. I bought a terrace house along Loteed Street. Later, war broke out. My house was reduced to ruins during one of the bombings. My eldest son, the child who just entered primary school, was buried inside. We had no choice but to rent a 2-bedroom room until the Phasations occupied Constant. They dragged my wife away and she never returned. Some time ago, someone requested me to identify her corpse. I couldn't even recognize her. She had rotten so much that you wouldn't even call it a corpse. However, in the pockets of her clothes, there was still our old water bill. When she was still at the rental apartment, she had always missed our home. It's the same for my younger daughter. I don't have much money now and can only barely maintain my life, but I wish to rebuild that house bit by bit. To be honest, I don't like telling others about my misfortune. I'd rather stay silent. But if I can really get help with the rebuilding efforts, then I can." Klein held a pen and paper and pretended to jot it down. He nodded gently and said, "Your wish will come true. Wait for me in front of the ruins of that house on Loteed Street tomorrow." At the same time, he pushed a one-solly note over. "This is for your drinks. My treat." The man's eyes flickered. He seemed to want to refuse it, but in the end, he still picked up the note. The next day, after sending his younger daughter to the church school, he walked along the familiar path to the familiar Loteed Street and saw that familiar house. Its chimney, its windows, its door, and the weeds on its walls hadn't changed at all. It was so familiar, as if its beautiful female owner would open the door in the next second and walk the 2 children out to welcome their father. The man was stunned, unable to believe that this was real. However, even if it was an illusion, he was willing to embrace it. After several days, Klein, who had completed a slew of similar wishes, pushed open the window of the hotel and snapped his fingers in the morning light fog. In an area of the city overlooking Constant, Welch's father woke up out of habit due to his dreams of his dead son and family. He walked to the balcony to take in the morning air. Under the light of dawn, he suddenly saw chimneys and blast furnaces that resembled a forest. Alongside them were tall buildings. The former Constant city had presented itself to him, bathed in the orange light of dawn. Chapter 1298 Departure. As the residents of Constant were stunned by the miracle in front of them, Klein had already carried his suitcase and left the city with the roads. After creating such a huge commotion, he was worried that Zeradol would lock onto his location, so he didn't dare to stay any longer. With his present level and strength, he wasn't too afraid of fighting Zeradol head-on. However, he didn't wish to be ambushed. For Beyonders of the Seer pathway, being prepared and not was completely different. Once Klein revealed his location and didn't leave in time, an unprepared him would end up facing Zeradol. He could imagine that even if he was now Sapphira Castle's owner and still had one more resurrection chance, there was also a huge risk of completely perishing. Furthermore, he didn't know what state Amon was in right now. Was he still being pursued by the true creator? Was it possible for him to suddenly appear by his side and steal everything? Due to this thought, Klein once again embarked on his journey. In the basement of a house in Southville County. The few Sequence 7 Beyonders of the Abraham family gathered here according to a prior agreement. That's pretty much it. Dorian Gray shared what Mr. Dorr had said in its entirety through his student, Furs. The years of exile and being sealed was enough to drive the ancestor crazy. He only occasionally regains lucidity. Even just directly speaking to him can result in mental corruption from his evil intent. A man wearing gold-rimmed glasses looking like a university professor sighed. So that's the reason. His expression revealed some relief, as if he could finally admit that the curse was a result of the ancestors' pleas for help. After a 1-second pause, the man said with a determined expression, "We have to think of a way to help the ancestor escape. This way, our curse will be completely removed." "Verdun, are you crazy? If a crazy king of angels returns, it will destroy the entire family." Dorian couldn't help but chide him. The man named Verdun looked at the other family members and said with a sullen expression, "That's why we have to hurry. While the ancestor still has a portion of his lucidity, we should let him return to the real world. Once he escapes from his exiled, sealed state and has enough anchors, he would definitely gradually regain his rationality." "Dorian, you've degenerated. You no longer wish to restore the glory of our family, to allow us to return to the apex of the northern and southern continent. You only wish to live a stable but mediocre life. Besides, can you be sure that Mr. Fool will keep providing blessings? Perhaps one day, he will be like the 7 deities who won't respond to most prayers." Dorian fell silent for a few seconds. "However, the risk in this area will definitely be lower than helping the ancestor escape. Ever since I believed in Mr. Fool and sincerely prayed to him, I haven't been affected by the full moon ravings for many months. If not for the fact that I'm no longer young, I'd even have the confidence of consuming a sequence 6 scribe potion. Even so, given time, I still have a good chance of advancing. If someone like me who's older than a certain age can do it, our next generation and their descendants will definitely be able to break free from our original restrictions and have a chance to become demigods." Hearing Dorian's words, the 2 men and 2 ladies other than Verdun nodded in agreement. They had already made some of their descendants believe in Mr. Fool, and through a few months of observation, they were certain that it was effective. They were planning on praying to Mr. Fool themselves. Noticing Verdun's nasty expression, Dorian softened his tone and said, "More importantly, we don't have the strength to complete the ritual at all. A demigod of any pathway is not easy to deal with. Among them, the corresponding demigods of the seer and marauder are cunning, bizarre, and dangerous. Even if we're willing to sacrifice ourselves and use a grade 0 sealed artifact, it's difficult to capture them." Verdun nudged his gold-rimmed spectacles and slowly exhaled. "I won't stop you from changing your faith to the Fool. If you can get that existence's help to aid the ancestors' escape, that would be the best development. But before that, I will do my best to prepare the ritual. Dorian, you have to remember that the bloodline and glory of the Abraham family comes from the ancestor. Without him, there will be no us. If this matter requires a sacrifice, then I'll do it." He stood up, put on his hat, and walked out of the basement. Dorian watched him leave and finally sighed. Verdun has been studying all kinds of mysticism information, hoping to find a way to completely resolve the family's curse. I believe that such persistence is already in his blood. The other Abraham family members nodded in unison. After he confirms that he can't complete the ritual, he should give up. They too hoped that Verdun would succeed, but they found it virtually impossible. On Blue Mountain Island, where Biyao was located, the private harbor that originally belonged to the resistance. A group of workers, who had just finished laying the gas pipes, were just about to find a place to rest and wait for the carriage sent by the Church of the Sea God to ferry them back to Biyao when they saw the half-giants purportedly from the northern Fairfax Islands carry heavy, grayish-white stone materials. Each step left an imprint on the land. These workers had participated in the construction of harbors, cathedrals, and art museums, so they knew how heavy the grayish-white stone materials were. They remembered that, even with the help of logs, horses, and machinery, it was very difficult for people to transport such stone materials. Yet, the half-giants held them as easily as holding toys. This display of strength was simply ridiculous. When Derek saw that the outer walls and some of the buildings of the town had been built under the efforts of the City of Silver's reconnaissance team, he nodded and said to Lievel and Candace, "It's time to return to the City of Silver and tell the chief about the situation here." None of the members of the City of Silver's reconnaissance team objected. They were very excited as they agreed with Elder Derek's decision. Although they hadn't been here for long, they had long fallen in love with this new hometown. They had fallen in love with the warmth of the sun in the day and the peace of the crimson moon in the night. They couldn't wait to let their family and friends experience it and enjoy it. Upon seeing this, Derek subconsciously straightened his back. He controlled himself and didn't let his smile appear. He calmly said to Candace, "Come back to the City of Silver with me and tell the chief and the other elders of the 6-member council about the situation here." "Oh, you too, Genord. Laeval, you're in charge of maintaining order here." He was worried that he wouldn't be able to convince the current chief, Wait Chermont, and company, so he decided on bringing 2 companions with him. After settling the corresponding matters, Derek led Candace and Genord to a secluded spot in the new City of Silver. He lowered his head, clasped his hands, and prayed to Mr. Fool, making a wish to return to the City of Silver immediately. Without a sound, the scene around them became blurry and stretched. Then, it immediately fixed and quickly became clear. In front of their eyes, they saw a city wall with weeds fluttering in the air. In just a few seconds, Derek and his 2 subordinates returned to the entrance of the City of Silver. "This is a miracle." Candace rubbed her eyes with a hand that wasn't holding a weapon, and marveled from the bottom of her heart. She had imagined many ways of returning to the City of Silver, but she had never thought of returning so directly. To her, this was a miracle bestowed by a deity. Genord shook the glass lantern in his hand and muttered without thinking, "This is much brighter than the beast-hide lantern." Before he could finish his sentence, he came to his senses and revealed a pure smile without a hint of gloominess. This time, they would be the messengers of dawn who would lead the residents of the City of Silver out of the forsaken land of the gods. Derek heaved a sigh of relief and maintained his stern expression. "Let's immediately find the chief and arrange for everyone to carry out the migration." He had heard Mr. Hanged Man talk about many matters that failed at the cusp of success. He didn't wish for the City of Silver to have such an outcome. As such, all the other matters had to be done as quickly as possible. When they passed through the door, the City of Silver residents in charge of guarding the door looked curiously at the 3 scouts and saw hope from their rosy, glowing faces. "Did Laeval and the others not come back?" Someone asked worriedly, afraid that the other members of the reconnaissance team had already sacrificed themselves. Derek simply replied, "They've remained in the outside world to build a temporary camp." The guards didn't ask further, afraid that they would delay their time. They watched as Derek and company headed for the Twin Towers. Not long after, Derek, Candace, and Genord saw Chief Wait Chermont and the other members of the 6-member council. They described the key points of what they saw and heard in the outside world. At the end of the report, they even took out pocket watches, music boxes, and other exquisite machinery to prove it. The members of the 6-member council other than the 2. 5-meter-tall Wait Chermont, who had a tattooed symbol on his head, and Derek, looked at each other and sighed. "Your experience is like a dream." "No, I can't even dream of such a scene." With that said, he solemnly asked, "Has the dungeon meant to store the sealed artifacts been constructed?" "That was the first building we completed." Derek gave an extremely clear answer. Wait nodded slightly and immediately issued an order. "Get everyone to bring their necessary items and gather at the training ground. To prevent any accidents, we will directly pray to Mr. Fool and ask him to transfer us over." Having said that, Wait pondered for a moment and said, "Mr. Fool has previously sent a revelation to let us wait for another 3 hours for the ancient survivors from Moon City to rendezvous with us. However, this doesn't affect our preparations ahead of time. Also, tell everyone that the environment in Moon City is very tough. Many of them have deformities. We have to look at them normally." Although the City of Silver had the black-faced grass as their staple, they would eat the flesh of monsters from time to replenish their strength. This made them occasionally have deformed children. Therefore, everyone was no stranger to this phenomenon. "All right." The other members of the 6-member council responded without any hesitation, revealing an irresistible, excited expression. This time, they were no longer seeing the light, but were directly welcoming the day. Chapter 1299 Milk and Honey. The Forsaken Land of the Gods, Moon City. When Adal, Exian, and Russ heard the high priest's voice resound throughout the city, they became abnormally excited. They stood up almost at the same time and carried the beast-hide bags that they had prepared earlier on their backs. Inside were distributed mushroom powder, dried mushrooms, and various monster leathers, as well as different beyonder characteristics of different states. To them, even though they were excited and were full of hope for the future, the suffering they had been through made them take precautions. They tried their best to carry as much food as possible. A few flashes of lightning before, the priests of Moon City had received Mr. Fool's divine revelation and stopped sending out hunting teams. They also instructed every resident to pack their important items and prepare to leave at a moment's notice. In less than a minute, Adal and company walked out of their houses with lanterns in hand and arrived on the streets. As their eyes met, their faces, which were either filled with tumors or deformities, were filled with unconcealed joy. They had no negative emotions towards abandoning Moon City and leaving their hometown. This was the source of their nightmare. It was unknown how many generations of people had lost their happiness in their childhood. When they were gathered at the square with a high platform, they suppressed their excitement and lined up in an orderly manner, checking to see if the neighbors had already arrived. Soon, all the residents of Moon City arrived. High Priest Nim walked up the platform and said with a smile, "Everyone, I received a divine revelation. Mr. Fool is about to help us leave this cursed land and obtain a new lease of life. Praise be to Mr. Fool." He took the lead and pressed his right palm against his left chest. This was a gesture they had invented to praise Mr. Fool, and Mr. Fool hadn't objected to it. Praise Mr. Fool. The residents of Moon City pressed their right palms to their left chests, expressing their gratitude and devotion. As their voices echoed, the gray-haired Nim raised his hand and lowered it for silence. "We'll head to the City of Silver first and meet with the survivors there. Then, we will head to the World of Light together. Don't worry. Mr. Fool will protect us. Okay, shut your eyes and start to pray." With that said, the high priest clasped his hands and pressed them against his lips. He sincerely prayed to Mr. Fool, hoping that the mighty existence could satisfy the greatest wish that the Moon City had accumulated over the past 2,000 to 3,000 years, generations. In the next second, the demigod of the Evernight pathway acutely sensed the changes in his surroundings. He opened his eyes, surveyed his surroundings, and discovered that stone pillars were becoming clearer. Lanterns hung on it as tall figures rapidly outlined. "This is the City of Silver? We've already arrived in the City of Silver. This is the might of a deity. Praise Mr. Fool." Adal, Exian, and company quickly observed their surroundings. They subconsciously had a certain good impression of the City of Silver. As a missionary of God, His Excellency Gehrman Sparrow had once mentioned that he had first arrived in the City of Silver after entering this cursed, forsaken land. This was the beginning of where God's brilliance spread out from the eternal darkness. It was the origins of all hope. The figures quickly became clear. Most of them were more than 2 meters tall. Their facial features and bodies were normal and there were no signs of deformation. They too were sizing up the residents of Moon City with curious and wary gazes. Their oppressive height and the enviousness of their normality made Exian, Russ, and the others nervous. They felt inferior and uneasy. However, with a sweep of their gaze, they saw quite a number of City of Silver residents biting mushrooms that had roasted surfaces. From time to time, they would suck the hot liquid from white, full mushrooms. This familiar scene caused the people of Moon City to gradually relax as they treated these half-giants as their own. The chief of the 6-member council, Wade Chermont, nodded and said to Nim, who was supposedly the leader of Moon City, "Are you ready?" His gaze was calm and natural. He didn't look down on them because of their terrifying appearance. Afraid that an accident would happen, Nim immediately replied, "Ready and good to go." Wade Chermont immediately cast his gaze at the City of Silver residents. "Finish your meal within 3 minutes and begin praying." In less than a minute, the residents of the City of Silver finished their milk and put away the remaining food in their hands. They sincerely prayed to Mr. Fool. The miraculous descent of the ancient survivors of Moon City made them more confident in leaving the forsaken land of the gods. They truly believed in Mr. Fool. A few seconds later, everyone in the City of Silver's training ground disappeared. The city was left completely silent. Soon, the corrupted weeds would grow, and monsters would wander around the streets and houses. In just a few blinks of an eye, the residents of the city of Silver and Moon City arrived in front of the giant king's palace, which had the dusk frozen. This was a ritual that Klein had deliberately planned. It was to allow the ancient survivors of the forsaken land of the gods to bid farewell to the past. Shocked by the grandeur, epicness, and mythical impression of the giant king's court, the residents of the city of Silver subconsciously turned their heads and looked down and into the distance. Beyond the orange-red dusk, the ground was completely blanketed in darkness. Occasionally, lightning would flash across the sky, revealing the outline of ancient buildings, towering mountains, and the deformed plants. As the lightning descended, darkness surged in again, devouring everything. Then, the city of Silver and Moon City residents turned their heads and cast their gaze deep into the giant king's palace. There was an open door, and outside the door was a blazing golden ocean. The people who were blinded by the sunlight immediately felt their surroundings become blurry, and the scene quickly shattered. The fragments quickly reassembled, turning into a deep blue ocean, the smell of fish, striking sounds, and the orange-red sun that had yet to come close to the horizon. The residents of Moon City and the City of Silver looked around in shock and anticipation. They saw the luxuriant forest that wasn't distorted at all. They saw the stone buildings that had yet to have been refurbished. They saw Laeval and company and saw the path towards the harbor and the ship that was docked there. Many people's vision turned blurry as though they were undergoing the catharsis of the holy light. They could clearly sense that there was no depravity, filth, or mysterious power here. Most of the City of Silver and Moon City residents lowered their heads and knelt on the ground, praising Mr. Fool loudly as they kissed the sweet-smelling soil. It wasn't that the others weren't grateful to Mr. Fool, but that they were still spellbound by such a scene. Every fiber of their being was shocked. After they recovered from their initial shock, Laeval went up to meet his wife and daughter. As he approached, he couldn't hold back his excitement and joy. He opened his mouth, wanting to tell his wife and children what he had seen and heard during this period of time. However, he realized that there were just too many things he wanted to share. Like countless rushing rivers, they surged to his throat and blocked his voice. After a few seconds, Laeval said, We have a new home." Before he could finish his sentence, the nearly 2.5-meter-tall half-giant hurriedly reached his hand into his pocket and extended it towards his wife and daughter. "This is given to us by the Oracle, milk candy. All of them say it's delicious." A smile appeared on Laeval's face. There were two objects which were the size of a thumb and wrapped in thin sheets of paper. Its surface was wrinkled, having soaked in a little sweat. Milk candy. Laeval's wife didn't quite understand this term. It was a new word in Jotun that mixed milk and honey. Their daughter was infected by her father's emotions. She boldly took the candy and was about to stuff it into her mouth. No, you have to peel off the outer layer." Laeval hurriedly took back the two milk candy and peeled off the wrapper before handing one each to his wife and daughter. His daughter bit down and ground her teeth forcefully, producing a cracking sound. She narrowed her eyes slowly and her expression gradually became more intoxicated. During this process, she couldn't bear to even speak. Seeing her daughter's behavior, Laeval's wife ate the candy. She felt that this was a very precious thing. She didn't bite it to pieces directly, but used her oral cavity to wrap around it and let it slowly melt away. The indescribable milk fragrance and sweetness slowly spread out, intoxicating Laeval's wife. When Laeval saw this, his smile widened as he said what had been left stuck in his throat. "The Oracle said that we can find a job in Biyao City, receive commissions, and earn gold pounds. That way, we can buy more milk candy. We can also sell beyonder characteristics and monster leather we have no need for to the Church of Sea God. Sea God is Mr. Fool's subsidiary god. It'll be dark soon. I'll bring you to the beach to watch the sunset. It's really beautiful. I visit it every day. I've always been waiting to bring the two of you there when you arrive. It's finally done. My anchor has stabilized significantly. Furthermore, granting the wishes of the City of Silver and Moon City has allowed my miracle invoker potion to digest by quite a bit. However, it isn't as much as restoring Constant City. Indeed, being a god of wishes isn't the most accurate form of acting. Above the gray fog, Klein slowly exhaled and threw the staff of the stars back onto the junk pile. Following that, he would continue wandering and creating miracles. He would occasionally head to the forsaken land of the gods and transform some monsters into marionettes to prepare for the subsequent ritual. As for the next stage of acting as a miracle invoker, Klein planned on accumulating wishes of changing appearances and figures to solve the deformities of Moon City, thereby creating a miracle. This isn't too difficult. Many maidens and ladies have a wish to remove acne, have double eyelids, and make their noses sharper. And I have a way to do it. This way, by accumulating the simple to the difficult, it will just take a matter of time to treat the deformed people of Moon City. In the outside world, they will feel even more inferior. Klein mumbled inwardly before he suddenly laughed self-deprecatingly. In that case, I can call myself the ruler of the beauty industry, the guardian of architects and the construction workers, the miracle creator of long-distance travel. After entering the waters that didn't have a safe sea route, Queen Mystic Bernadette seemed to have lost her sense of time. If not for the precise wall clock in her captain's cabin, she definitely would have forgotten how many days it had been since she entered this perilous region. The violent winds and torrential rain made the boat fly up from time to time, sometimes getting thrown to the side, as if it was a preview to the impending apocalypse. Bernadette watched calmly as she waited patiently without interfering with the dawn situation. After some time, the storm finally calmed down. At this moment, a black outline appeared in the distance. Chapter 1300. The fourth person. Bernadette stared at the outline for a long time until it gradually became clearer as the dawn approached. It was the silhouette of a large island. On the island, there were huge, towering, dark green trees that almost bordered on black, covering the ground and mountain. Although Bernadette couldn't be sure that this was the primitive island that her father had once visited, her intuition as a clairvoyant told her that this was likely the place she was seeking. As the coastline entered her eyes, she pursed her lips and lowered her head. She chanted an honorific name, the fool that doesn't belong to this era, the mysterious ruler above the gray fog, the king of yellow and black who wields good luck. Right on the heels of that, Queen Mystic Bernadette raised her hand and made the crewless Dawn stop in the nearby waters without approaching the shore. At the same time, the sound of pianos, violins, cellos, flutes, and other musical instruments interweaved together into a lively tune. As the music echoed, the toast, steak, mashed potatoes, fried mushrooms, and other dishes on a plate jumped up one after another and returned to the oven amidst a dance or threw themselves into the trash can. The red wine bottle, white dining cloth, and other items had all returned to their original positions. They either sealed themselves with wooden corks or kept folding themselves neatly. Then, Bernadette gently threw out a bright and unrealistic ball of yarn with her right hand. The ball rolled into the void, leaving a thread behind. Bernadette followed it and strolled through the spirit world before arriving at the border of the nameless island. This Queen Mystic wasn't in a rush to head deeper. She searched for the possible existence of the Black Emperor Mausoleum, and she cautiously made her sea-like blue eyes turn dark and deep. She temporarily lost focus, as though she was prying into the secrets of the River of Fate. A few seconds later, Bernadette's eyes returned to normal as she subconsciously looked up into the sky. She felt that she was being watched by a certain existence. Of course, this was something she had expected, as she had taken the initiative to recite Mr. Fool's honorific name. Above the gray fog, in the ancient palace, Klein accommodated the Fool's card, draped himself with the curtain, and held the staff of the stars. He was checking the situation on the island through Queen Mystic's prayer light. In his true vision's field, the island was shrouded in a thin layer of distorted blackness. It made it impossible for him to see the situation inside directly. He could only obtain Bernadette's point of view. Even if it's not the primitive island that Emperor Roselle discovered, this place isn't simple. Klein nodded indiscernibly as he waited for Queen Mystic to do a deeper exploration. Bernadette didn't use the ball of yarn anymore, because she had a premonition that she was going to lead herself into a dangerous abyss that she had no way of fending off. She took out an illusory hat and wore it. Her captain-looking figure disappeared, her existence concealed. This was also one of the fairy tale magic that stemmed from mystical reenactment. At its core was a hat that made one invisible. Then, Bernadette followed a path that appeared to have been opened up by humans and entered the forest consisting of huge trees. There were no birds chirping, no wild beast roars, or disturbance caused by crawling insects. It was so peaceful as if time had frozen, so dead that there was no sign of life. According to Bernadette's understanding, there should be many supernatural beings that had already gone extinct in the outside world. Normally, it would be quite lively. But now, she felt as if she was walking through an uninhabited cemetery. Every giant tree was a tombstone. If it were any of the Beyonders with weaker minds, they would definitely feel tense. Burdened with a heavy pressure, they would slowly approach the edge of losing control. However, Bernadette's expression didn't change at all, as though she was already used to proceeding through danger and strangeness. After walking for nearly half an hour, she still didn't see any living thing or even sense the wind. Suddenly, her vision opened up, because the huge trees in front of her had become sparse. Bernadette didn't feel any joy. Instead, she slowed down and raised her hand to press against her glabella. A pair of eyes that were without eyelashes appeared in front of her, looking cold and heartless. Then, the pair of eyes of mystery prying was grabbed by invisible hands and placed on an invisible person's face. This was Bernadette's invisible servant. The invisible servant brought the eyes of mystery prying and quickly crossed the remaining path to the open forest. During this process, its vision gradually became clearer, as if it was no longer affected by the faint blackness in the air. Finally, the invisible servant arrived at the boundary of the open region and transmitted the situation to Bernadette through the eyes of mystery prying. Outside the sparse forest, there was an empty space. There were countless creatures prostrating there. Among them were red dragons with skin flowing with flames. There were tree-ants that had gnarls for eyes and hollows for mouths. There were demonic wolves with 8 legs, giants with 4 long limbs, and feathered serpents with oily feathers and scales with a dark green shade. The latter coiled there, resembling small hills. There were also different kinds of creatures that looked like human and wild beast hybrids. At this moment, they were all facing one direction. They had their upper bodies or heads prostrated, as though they were worshipping an unknown existence. None of them made a sound. There were even a few humans among them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When Bernadette counted a few humanoid creatures, her blue eyes suddenly widened. She had learned from Admiral of Stars Catlia that the primitive island which her father had discovered had a special type of corruption that allowed dead creatures to return here, to the source, regardless of where their corpses were. Amongst the knights who served Emperor Roselle, Grimm was first to be killed because of this, followed by William and Polly. However, apart from the 3 of them, no one else was sacrificed in corresponding matters. And at that moment, there were 5 supernatural or mutated creatures present. In addition, Bernadette also knew that her father had eventually resolved the corruption problem and made the primitive island his secret base. Is this not the island? Queen Mystic examined the 5 humans through the eyes of mystery prying. They were dressed in opulent clothes from Roselle's era. Their faces were pale, their skins shriveled, and they looked more like zombies than humans. As the 5 of them were prostrating, Bernadette temporarily couldn't see their faces. She could only patiently wait for the praying to end. A few minutes later, those creatures straightened their bodies and the entire forest came alive. Seizing this opportunity, Bernadette saw the 5 of them and compared them with her memories and the images she knew. Grimm, he really is Grimm. This is the primitive island. That's Uncle William. I remember him. He taught me swordplay before. Uncle Polly. When she recognized the 4th person, a look of astonishment could be seen on Bernadette's face. That person was Edwards. In Bernadette's memory, the knight had outlived her father's death. Then, he migrated his family to Lemberg. He hadn't died on this primitive island. According to the information she received from Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina, Edwards had lived for nearly 100 years. He died peacefully and was buried in a cemetery in the suburbs of Lemberg. Uncle Edwards has also returned to this island. Didn't he not experience any corruption and didn't die because of this? Thoughts flashed through Bernadette's mind one after another. As a result, the eyes of mystery prying on the invisible servant's face kept staring at the human suspected to be Edwards. The gentleman had an old appearance and his hair was completely white. It was the same portrait of the ancestor in his advanced years, the one that Edwina Edwards had shown her. And from his facial features and outline, Bernadette could tell what he looked like in his prime. At that time, Edwards had been her equestrian teacher. Suddenly, the human who was suspected to be Edwards turned his head and gazed coldly at the invisible servant. Although Bernadette had inherited quite a bit of Emperor Roselle's inheritance, she definitely didn't rely on items to advance to this point in the mysterious world. At that moment, she made a prompt decision and directly made the eyes of mystery prying vanish, allowing the invisible servant to return to the spirit world. Right on the heels of that, she quietly changed her position. At the same time, above the gray fog, Klein tapped the edge of the long model table and enhanced the probability of Bernadette not being discovered. When the person suspected to be Edwards retracted his blank gaze and walked to a different spot in the primitive forest with the surrounding creatures, Klein frowned slightly and muttered to himself, what kind of anomaly happened? He remembered that the Emperor had already resolved the corruption of the cosmos on this primitive island when he was alive. However, these creatures were still worshipping an unknown existence, holding a mysterious ritual that was close to the earliest descriptions in the diary. After the Emperor's death, did a particular entity from the cosmos infiltrate this place again? Or is it that they're worshipping some symbol left behind by the Emperor? Who are the other two? They look like Edwards and Benjamin Abraham from the historical fragment. Klein, who was temporarily unable to see what was being worshipped due to the faint black interference of the island, could only follow Bernadette's eyes to observe the surroundings. After a while, Bernadette, who was proficient in prophesying, finally confirmed that there was no living creature in the open space. She summoned the invisible servant again and gave it the eyes of mystery prying. The invisible servant passed through the sparse areas of the forest and the empty area, carefully arriving at the spot where the creatures had been worshipping. There was a huge rock, and on it was a simple baldachin made of dark red wood. The invisible servant circled halfway and arrived in front of the baldachin. It was empty inside. There was no statue, nor was there an emblem formed from symbols. The creatures on this island were praying to something that didn't seem to exist. Chapter 1301 New Life. Through the eyes of mystery prying, Bernadette saw that the interior of the dark red baldachin was empty, nothing was there. All she could see were shadows that usually shrouded things in reality. She was unable to prophesize anything from it. Having no choice but to look away, she followed her intuition and made the invisible servant walk towards the other end of the open area, which was also part of the primitive forest filled with towering trees. As the invisible servant couldn't be too far away from her, she silently followed behind while wearing the invisibility hat. She unhurriedly passed through the area where all the creatures on the island were gathered. Here, the sky seemed to be perpetually gloomy, one permeated by a faint blackness. Time passed quickly. The invisible servant entered the forest that blotted out the sky with the tree branches and everything before it suddenly dimmed. Right on the heels of that, the nearly transparent, cold, and undetectable eyes of mystery prying saw through the dim environment. There were pale white corpses placed in between the trees. Skulls and rotting corpses hung down from many branches. They consisted of dragons, avian creatures, and some had 8 legs, while others were strange giant trees that occupied every empty spot in the forest. At a glance, Bernadette seemed to have arrived at a cemetery. A scene naturally surfaced in her mind. It was a scene of supernatural beings giving birth to their descendants before they died, thus passing on their beyonder characteristics to them. And these creatures would struggle towards this region in the primitive forest from every direction, in search of an unoccupied spot. Then, facing a particular direction, they would silently die, gradually rotting and being reduced to bones. What's the meaning behind this? As a clairvoyant, Bernadette fully believed that the scenes produced in her mind were what had happened in the real world. However, she was puzzled about the type of power that made the creatures on this primitive island choose this area as their tomb. Furthermore, since Grimm, William, and Polly, who had died long ago, appeared to remain alive in some form, it didn't make sense that supernatural and mutated creatures that had stayed on this island all this while and had suffered even more corruption would end up dying. This made Bernadette frown slightly as she directed the invisible servant to continue proceeding deeper into the creature cemetery. Just like that, the invisible servant proceeded forward for nearly 15 minutes in this forest filled with bones and corpses. Finally, it saw a fourth object beyond trees, weeds, and corpses. It was a black stone pillar. It was very thick, with a width spanning about 6 arm spans, and 30 to 40 meters tall. Its surface was covered with rings which were signs of weathering. It resembled a finger wearing rings that didn't suit its size. Bernadette made the eyes of mystery prying observe the stone pillar for several seconds, but she didn't discover anything mysterious about it. It was as though it was a symbol that was casually erected. The invisible servant looked around and discovered that the surrounding corpses around the stone pillar didn't suffer from serious rot. They were even covered in rather intact flesh and skin. There aren't any supernatural powers or magical effects that are different from other places. Unless the new deceased were gathered near the stone pillar, it's impossible for them to have such a unified trend. Bernadette suspected that it wasn't because there was no mysterious influence in this matter, but that it would only happen at a specific moment. She didn't use her powers of prophecy to search for the reason. This was because a prophecy, at its core, was to pry into the secrets of the river of fate. The more serious the problem involved was, and the higher her status and level, the more damage the backlash would bring to her. And at this moment, it was impossible for Bernadette to not be cautious. She was afraid that it might involve an unknown existence. In addition, this hadn't caused any harm to her. She didn't have to take the risk to make a prophecy. After searching for a while to no avail, the invisible servant continued forward, attempting to pass through the cemetery and head to other regions of the forest. Just then, Bernadette heard a rustling sound. It was the sound of a breeze passing through the vegetation, a tidal wave in the void. Ever since she landed on this strange island, this was Bernadette's first time feeling the wind. Subconsciously, she made the invisible servant look back at the black stone pillar. In the eyes of mystery prying, the corpses around the stone pillar began to rot and shed one by one. New flesh and blood grew out like they had their own spirituality, and their skin slowly covered this harrowing scene 1 inch at a time. This change lasted for less than 10 seconds before stopping. A small number of the corpses no longer showed any signs of decay. It looked like they had just died. In the next second, a mutated curly-haired baboon and a wolf with 8 legs wobbled to their feet. Their fur was slightly white and their skin was slightly dry, their eyes dull and cold. Then, the 2 originally deceased creatures each got their bearings and left the cemetery from different spots. Bernadette's gaze froze as she watched this. Her brows raised slightly as she finally understood why the creatures on this island had struggled to come to this area before dying and why they had to die here. Here, death, an endpoint, didn't mean entering the state of eternal slumber, but rather a new beginning. Furthermore, this wasn't the resurrection of a zombie or skeleton that a spirit guide was capable of. It was a new life with a certain will and vitality. A distortion and disorder of the world's underlying rules? In addition, it seems to contain some mystery from the Black Emperor's resurrection. However, those who obtain new life aren't in a proper state. They're even closer to zombies. Such revivals are very problematic. Klein, who was above the gray fog, also saw this scene and had many guesses. Of course, this was under the premise that the Emperor had fundamentally left his last mausoleum here and exerted some form of influence here. As he thought about it, Klein rejected this idea. This was because, before the Emperor became an angel, this primitive island had a similar situation. The dead Grimm was proof. Yes, the exact details that happened back then might not be the same as what's happening now. Perhaps, compared to the past, it has already been distorted and disordered. Klein nodded gently, prepared to bless and protect Bernadette at any time. Bernadette also came up with a guess. She didn't allow the invisible servant to stay in its spot to wait for a new tide of life. This was because she had foreseen a development. After being repeatedly affected by the new tide of life, the invisible servant would oddly develop some sort of sentience and come alive. In addition, it wasn't that the invisible servant hadn't done any investigation prior to this, but it had ultimately failed to discover anything special about the black stone pillar. Bernadette didn't believe that it would gain anything new by remaining here. In such a situation, it was better to establish a basic understanding of the primitive island rather than alarming an unknown existence due to a deeper study. Many a time, there were problems that eluded one in the beginning, but the answer might be nearer to the end. This was thanks to the experience that Bernadette had accumulated over all these years. The corpses on the trees and branches gradually grew fewer as the invisible servant moved forward. During this process, Bernadette discovered another phenomenon. In the new tide of life, it wasn't certain that a corpse would be revived. However, once they revived and left the empty area, the rest of the corpses would be attracted like metal to magnets in the next 5 minutes. They would stiffly move towards the center, filling up the corresponding spots like they were in line for a bestowment. The law of beyonder characteristics convergence? No, it doesn't seem like it. The deceased have already passed down their characteristics. As Bernadette's thoughts wandered, she suddenly thought of a question. It's impossible for the deceased to produce new beyonder characteristics after obtaining new life, but do they still possess their powers in their previous lives? Once I have a complete grasp of the situation on this island, I can find a resurrected being to test it out. Bernadette quickly made a decision and followed the invisible servant's route forward. She didn't use any beyonder powers other than her invisibility hat. She hoped that she wouldn't disturb the environment and miss out on any details. Therefore, she didn't walk too fast. She took about 15 minutes to leave the cemetery. The invisible servant had already entered the forest up ahead. It could hear the occasional bird chirping and beast roars. The vibrant vitality here was different from the other remaining regions. Above the gray fog, Klein sighed. Thankfully, I'm now the owner of Sapphira Castle. Here, I have the status of a king of angels. I can observe reality for as long as I want to, and I don't have to worry about draining my spirituality. Yes, the only thing I need to pay attention to is my body that's hidden in the ancient city located in the fog of history before the first epoch. After traveling for another few minutes, the invisible servant suddenly saw something that appeared incongruous to the primitive island's environment. It was a log cabin that seemed to be a residence of a forest ranger. The log cabin was brown in color and was less than 2.5 meters tall. It looked like it was prepared for humans, but every detail was rough and crude. At that moment, the cabin's door was open, allowing Bernadette to see the situation inside through the eyes of mystery prying. A wooden table, a fur-covered bed, and a low-back chair formed a scene of a residence lived by humans. Who lives here? With a thought from Bernadette, the invisible servant rapidly approached the cabin in search for possible clues. It then realized that the interior of the cabin was ice-cold. Apart from the furniture, there was nothing else. It seemed like no one had lived there for a very long time. Just as Bernadette was using the eyes of mystery prying to carefully inspect every detail in the cabin, she suddenly had a premonition. She hurriedly made the invisible servant turn around. At some point in time, a person had appeared behind the invisible servant. He was wearing luxurious clothes from the Roselle era. His hair was completely white, and he looked old. He had a pair of light blue eyes that were extremely cold and blank. Edwards. This was the knight who had outlived the Emperor, Vice Admiral Iceberg Edwina's ancestor. Edward stared at the invisible servant for a few seconds. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and said in a low voice, "Our Highness." Chapter 1302. The scene in the prophecy. Bernadette fell silent for 2 seconds before replying through the invisible servant, "Uncle Edwards, why are you here?" She used the way she addressed him when she was young to reduce the chances of an accident. Her voice reverberated in the surrounding air with the invisible servant as a conduit. It was dry, dull, and completely different from normal. Edwards's face was pale. It was as if he had just crawled out of the grave without any warmth. I don't know either. When I woke up, I discovered that I had returned to this island. This might be my destiny. A destiny of guarding His Majesty. He paused with every word he said, but he didn't give the impression that he was out of breath. It seemed like he hadn't spoken for a long time, so much so that his throat was rusty. He wasn't used to speaking. Without waiting for Bernadette's further inquiries, the knight, who was famous across the continent more than 100 years ago, added with a flat tone, His Majesty's mausoleum is nearby. I've been guarding this place, waiting for him to revive. But after so many years, the mausoleum has never changed. There haven't been any signs of a resurrection. Bernadette made the invisible servant look around and said, This log cabin is where you live? Edwards's exposed skin was slightly shriveled. It matched the aging spots he originally had. His voice was low and hoarse as he answered, That's right. I used the surrounding trees to make materials to build this cabin. Bernadette's invisible servant looked in the direction where she had come from. Uncle William and the others aren't with you? Edwards's cold, wooden eyes moved. They have long been corrupted and are dead. Although they've come back to life, they're more like monsters. They aren't their former selves. Your Highness, you must be wary of them and avoid them. Do not trust anyone but Benjamin and me. Bernadette fell silent for a while before asking through the invisible servant, Where's my father's mausoleum? I want to take a look. Edwards's somewhat stiff neck moved. Okay. He then took a step towards the cabin and took out a rusted black axe. I'll take you there, Edwards said as he looked at the invisible servant that normally couldn't be seen. During this process, his expression was stiff and almost unchanged. All right. Along the periphery of the forest, Bernadette responded using the invisible servant to make her hoarse voice echo in the surroundings. Edwards was almost 9 meters tall, and he looked rather thin. He carried his axe and walked behind the log cabin before saying in a flat tone, It's very close. Be careful along the way. Bernadette immediately controlled the invisible servant and made it follow the luxuriously dressed Edwards. Walking through the forest one after another, Bernadette suddenly made the invisible servant ask, Uncle Edwards, what were you worshipping in the empty space from before? Edwards didn't turn his head as he maintained the same pace. His Majesty. At least 2 kilometers behind him and the invisible servant, Bernadette immediately pricked up her brows. She took nearly 3 seconds to control her emotions. Through the invisible servant, she continued asking without any emotion, Uncle William and the others are worshipping him? Edwards paused, but he kept his back towards the invisible servant and the eyes of mystery prying. No. He slowed down as though he was thinking of an answer. I don't know what they worship. Bernadette's eyes narrowed slightly as though she could see some changes in the river of fate. She didn't ask any more questions as she made the invisible servant silently follow Edwards. Amidst the dark green, towering trees and the black, sharp shrubs, they headed for the island's mountain peak. In just 4 or 5 minutes, the trees up ahead disappeared. This wasn't a process that went from dense to sparse until there was nothing. Instead, the towering trees suddenly disappeared after an imaginary boundary line. Beyond the invisible line was a mountain that was hundreds of meters tall. It was covered by dark green trees that were almost black in color. From afar, it was almost as if it was one with the forest, virtually inseparable. However, the side of the mountain facing Edward and Bernadette was mostly without vegetation. Half of the mountain had been excavated. In the middle of the mountain, a pitch-black mausoleum stood there with a majestic appearance. Most of it was part of the mountain range. A small portion of it had signs of man-made constructions and polishing. It truly expounded on what it meant to be a mountain mausoleum. Thus, the mausoleum didn't look like the common pyramid. Instead, it looked more like a towering mountain. It wasn't exactly symmetrical, but it was definitely majestic. Perhaps the mausoleum itself had influenced its surroundings, or perhaps Edwards had cleaned the area. Its surface was void of weeds, nor was it covered with vines commonly seen in other mountains. This allowed Bernadette to see the various texts and symbols engraved on the mausoleum through the eyes of mystery prying. She saw the heavy 30-meter-tall stone door that seemed to be prepared for giants. Bernadette wasn't unfamiliar with those words and symbols. She didn't take much time to recognize them as either the civil code that was created by her father, the new social trends that he had established, or even some design drafts of some invention. Just as Bernadette was carefully examining it, Klein, who was above the gray fog, was completely certain that this was the last mausoleum left behind by Emperor Roselle. This was similar to the mausoleum he had seen in the Tudor ruins. It had the majesticness and distortion traits of the Black Emperor. After walking out of the primitive forest and passing through the invisible boundary, they arrived near the mausoleum. Edward stopped. He half-turned his body and aimed his pale face and cold eyes at the invisible servant. He said without any change in his voice, "Don't go in. It will interrupt the resurrection." Bernadette frowned slightly and thought for 2 seconds before using the eyes of mystery prying to lock onto the mausoleum. Then, her blue eyes that resembled the sea became extremely deep, like the surface of the sea before a storm. Under such circumstances, her eyes clearly lost focus as her vision turned blurry. She was prying into the secrets of the river of fate and making a prophecy for what would happen next. Klein tapped the long model table and increased the probability of her success. He then prepared himself to resist the corruption of the cosmos. Of course, the latter wasn't necessary, because Bernadette had a grade 0 sealed artifact that she could control. Bernadette raised her right hand the next second. Her skin instantly turned as white as snow. Her lips turned as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. An illusory, ancient mirror appeared in her hands. This was Snow White of her fairy tale magic. Bernadette had used it to enhance the success rate and accuracy of her prophecy. Silently, she saw a scene. The majestic and solemn dark mausoleum visibly shook as the tall, heavy stone door opened. Then, a huge black arm stretched out from the stone door. The style of this arm was close to that of the trees on the island. From its color and state, it looked more like a part of a shadow. However, it wasn't a thin layer, but was instead filled with flesh and blood. It looked extremely strange. It supported itself with its elbows and moved forward with great difficulty, as though it wanted to pull out bigger and more terrifying parts from within. Boom! The entire island began to shake. Boom! The transparent eyes of mystery prying suddenly shattered. Bernadette's eyes immediately closed, as if she had seen a blinding light or encountered some unbearable damage. Blood trickled down from the corners of her eyes as the color in her face drained significantly. On her body, a pair of illusory and holy wings spread out, descending upon her with its clean, white feathers to neutralize the invisible corruption. Indeed, she has the ability to resist. The Emperor sure left a huge inheritance for her. Heh. Before I taught Ma'am Hermit a lesson, she liked to use the eye of mystery prying to examine the people and objects around her. It definitely has something to do with how she was brought up. In short, it's all Roselle's fault. Klein heaved a sigh of relief as he couldn't help but criticize the Emperor. Then, his mind raced as he analyzed the scene that Bernadette had prophesied. A terrifying creature crawls out from the mausoleum after the stone door is opened. This might be the resurrected Roselle, or perhaps a symbol of some kind of disaster. For example, a particular outer deity who had once corrupted this island, or the primordial moon who secretly corrupted Roselle. Yes, even if it's Roselle, he definitely wouldn't be taking on the form of a human. He's even closer to that of a mythical creature, a deity. Also, I can't be sure if the terrifying creature is rational or if it can communicate. There's another important problem. Was the stone door opened by Bernadette or someone else? Or did the terrifying creature in the mausoleum do it by itself? If it's the latter, things might develop to the stage of the prophecy even if we don't do a thing. A prophecy is truly filled with ambiguity. Klein conjured a gold coin and flicked it, making a divination. The results of the dream divination showed that the mausoleum was both dangerous and safe. How do I interpret this? As Klein pondered, he focused his attention back on Bernadette. Bernadette took nearly a minute to recover and stopped appearing that week. However, she was temporarily unable to interpret the direction of the prophecy from the scene she saw. She could only confirm that the problem was definitely very complicated. Due to the eyes of mystery prying shattering, there was no way for her to use it to see the various secrets. All she could do was use the invisible servant's perception to observe the situation around her. She realized that Edwards remained silent and motionless when she was unable to control the invisible servant, as though he hadn't noticed anything abnormal. After some thought, Bernadette said to Edwards through the invisible servant, "Do you still remember the years you spent in Lemberg?" Edwards's indifferent blue eyes moved. "I remember." I think, at this point, he seemed to recall something. His expression twisted as though he was suffering some indescribable pain. In such a state, his eyes suddenly glowed with a strange light. I think I'm already dead." Chapter 1303 Coming to Life, Already Dead. Edwards turned his head and looked at Bernadette's invisible servant with his light blue eyes. His gaze was no longer cold and blank. It emitted a strange glint that was filled with disbelief. It was only at this moment that he seemed to realize that he had long died and had come back to life. He was no different from William, Polly, and Grimm, who he claimed were individuals who they needed to keep up one's guard against. This transformation lasted for only 2 seconds before Edwards's face twisted. His already pale skin rapidly dimmed as it ruptured inch by inch. Beneath his skin, the red pieces of flesh began to rot at a discernible speed, dripping foul yellow liquid. With a swoosh, Edwards raised the black axe in his hand. Oof! His axe ruthlessly cleaved the top of his head, as though it was trying to stop the bad thoughts that surfaced in his mind. The axe was heavy and sharp. It tore through Edwards's skull all the way to his glabella. Drip, drip, drip. Drops of milky white cerebrospinal fluid dripped down from the axe's blade, sliding across Edwards's grimaced and torn face, as though he had poured some milk onto a bright red strawberry. Don't come near me," Edwards said in a low and hoarse voice to Bernadette's invisible servant after striking himself in the head. Before he could finish his sentence, his expression returned to its blank state. The look in his eyes gradually turned hollow as he turned around and walked towards the forest. That thin and shriveled body of his stooped a little, as though his back was hunched. Bernadette had probed him because of the doubts and concerns she had about entering the mausoleum. All she could do was indirectly determine the problem with Edwards's existence, and see if she could obtain more clues from his answer. She never expected this knight from Roselle's era, who had been famous across the northern continent, would react in such an intense and strange manner. After 2 seconds of silence, Bernadette made the invisible servant say to Edwards's back, "Your descendants are doing pretty well. All of them are accomplished in a certain sense." Edwards, whose back was facing the mausoleum, stopped for a moment. Then, he continued forward, passing the invisible boundary and entering the forest. His target seemed to be in the direction of the cemetery with the stone pillar, the place where the deceased could obtain new life. At the same time, Bernadette looked up into the sky. The faint black colors that permeated the area had clearly faded, but there was an indescribable feeling. The entire primitive island underwent a subtle change that couldn't accurately be described. Suddenly, Bernadette, who was hiding at the edge of the invisible boundary, rubbed her back. She felt that it was heavy, as though there was something there. When her left palm touched her target, Bernadette realized that there was an extra strand of hair. At this moment, she was wearing an Inta-styled blouse with a large lace flower around the collar, an indigo-patterned captain's uniform, a pair of beige trousers, knee-length boots, and a triangular hat with feathers on it. She was dressed like the leader of a pirate ship. She styled herself such that her long chestnut hair was tied into a bun, leaving the remaining strands in a way that would reach the middle of her back. But now, even though her hairstyle remained unchanged, her hair had grown longer and reached her waist. Then, Bernadette lowered her head and looked at her right palm. She saw the fingernails of her 5 fingers extending. Queen Mystic didn't show any signs of surprise or panic. She followed the instincts of a clairvoyant and from all the experience she had accumulated over time. She took a few steps forward, and through an invisible boundary, she completely left the primitive forest and entered the empty area where the Black Emperor's mausoleum was. During this process, Bernadette even made the invisible servant return to the spirit world. 3 or 4 seconds later, she felt the earth shake. The mausoleum began to tremble visibly. Subconsciously, Bernadette turned to look at the primitive forest. Her gaze froze for a moment. The dark green trees were waving their branches and uprooting their roots. Then, like humans, they approached Bernadette. The entire primitive forest had come to life. Looking at the dense cluster of trees that seemed to blot out the sky surging at her, Bernadette had the feeling that doomsday was approaching. She felt as if the entire area would be blanketed by the forest. A gigantic red dragon with flames flowing across its skin rapidly flew into the sky. An 8-legged demonic wolf began to run madly between the trees. All the supernatural beings and mutated creatures on this island stirred as they rushed towards the mausoleum. Although she was a clairvoyant, Bernadette still didn't expect that her simple, indirect question would bring about such an anomaly. It was as though it was a key that had opened the door to the abyss. Above the gray fog, Klein saw a lot more. Together with his knowledge of mysticism, he had a certain guess. The situation of Edwards is different from William, Grimm, and Polly. It's like a loophole of the order on this primitive island, or rather, a shadow. When he realized that he was already dead, this loophole was discovered by the order, and it began to conduct repairs. And the repairs brought with it an enhancement of the order, causing the entire island to experience an anomaly. I can sense that the Black Emperor's powers are present here to a certain degree. It affected Edwards, causing him to maintain a portion of his will after obtaining new life. And where did the original order of this primitive island come from? As Klein's thoughts raced, he suddenly sensed that Bernadette was suffering certain anomalies. Thump, thump, thump. Bernadette could vaguely hear her own heartbeat. This heartbeat was rather chaotic, as though it was a combination of 2 sounds. 2. Bernadette's heart stirred as she calmly directed her attention back to herself. In the next second, she confirmed that there were 2 sources of her heartbeat. One came from her heart, the other from her abdomen. There seemed to be an additional heart in her abdomen, one that was rapidly expanding and contracting. Furthermore, this heart was developing bit by bit. Without needing to use her mystery-prying powers to look at her abdomen, Bernadette immediately sensed that there was a fetus in her womb. It had grown from the size of a grape to the size of a normal human palm. If it was left to grow, it didn't seem like it would take long before it matured. It would then tear open her mother's womb, and drill out while covered in blood. Unknowingly, Bernadette had become pregnant. Her spiritual perception and the sealed artifact on her body had failed to detect it in advance or attempt to stop it. It was as though she was powerless to deal with such an influence. Earth Mother. Primordial Moon. Mother Tree of Desire. 3 divine names flashed through Bernadette's mind. According to what she knew, there weren't many mysteries that could cause such an anomaly. Most of them came from domains related to the Earth and the Moon pathway. Sequence 0 of the plantar pathway was Mother. The primordial moon could make a stone have reproductive powers, while the Mother Tree of Desire seemed to possess some high sequence beyond her characteristics of the Moon pathway. Bernadette wasn't in a hurry to deal with the fetus in her stomach. Her gaze turned dark once again as she used her prophetic ability to see what her best choice was. This time, she only took 1 second to obtain the corresponding prophecy: survival lies inside the mausoleum. Without any hesitation, Bernadette reached out her right hand and quickly drew out words filled with stellar radiance. These words, which were similar to the words on the blasphemy slate, quickly interwove into a strange symbol and opened a secret door that seemed to lead deep into the spirit world. Following that, the secret door opened and a strong gust of wind blew out, transforming into an entity that was half man, half air. His upper body was wrapped in white cloth. Sage frontlet, Bernadette's tone was calm as she ordered in a dignified voice. The man responded respectfully and removed an accessory from the white cloth wrapped around his body. The core of this accessory was a vertical eye embedded with diamonds. It shimmered with pure light, exuding an abnormal holiness. It was filled with intelligence, but it also appeared cold without any warmth. Bernadette then took the accessory and embedded it into the middle of her forehead. This was a grade 0 sealed artifact which Bernadette usually didn't carry with her, as the negative effects were too severe. However, at this moment, the sage frontlet had an ability that was extremely important to Bernadette. She was willing to bear the consequences of not being able to use evil magic and the gradual influence that the Beyonder characteristic would have on her as it slowly fused with her. If she didn't remove the sage frontlet in a short period of time, it would be equivalent to having a sequence 2 potion splashed on her. When the time came, she could either end up lucky and succeed in advancing to become a sage, or lose control and become a monster. And without the supplementary ingredients and the corresponding ritual, the former's probability was nearly negligible. With the diamond vertical eye on her forehead, Bernadette's body began to turn incorporeal as she dissociated into a series of complicated knowledge. In that instant, she became a creature of pure information. The baby in her womb failed to obtain such a state as it fell to the ground. It was half the size of a normal baby. It already had facial features and limbs. Its skin was wrinkled, and it was dripping with sticky pus. As it left its mother's body, the undeveloped, it began to regress and quickly melted in the air. The baby was clearly unwilling to give up. It tried its best to open its eyes, which were sealed by the sticky liquid. It opened its mouth wide open in a bid to make a final struggle. At this moment, Klein, who was above the gray fog, rapped the edge of the long model table. Pa! He increased the probability of failure with respect to the baby struggling. Unable to maintain itself, the baby completely dissipated in front of the approaching black forest. At the same time, the flood of information that Bernadette had transformed into had entered the Black Emperor Mausoleum's interior through the heavy stone door as she reformed her original body. During this process, she seemed to see a black shadow. Chapter 1304 The Importance of Ideas. When she entered the Black Emperor's mausoleum, Bernadette vaguely saw a black shadow. However, after she extricated herself from being an embodiment of information, and reassembled her body with the pure, messy knowledge, she didn't sense anything. It was as though what she had just experienced was just an illusion. Queen Mystic wasn't in a rush to venture deep into the mausoleum. She stayed in her spot and carefully observed her surroundings. Without using the powers of mystery prying, everything was clearly presented before her eyes. The interior of the Black Emperor Mausoleum was empty. Apart from the pitch-black walls and the high platform in the middle, there was nothing. On the high platform, there was a chair that looked like it was prepared for a giant. It was made of iron, and its surface was engraved with complicated and distorted patterns. At the top of the seat, there was a crown-shaped object. At this moment, there wasn't a single figure on the huge, heavy seat, as if it was waiting for its emperor to return. Just as Bernadette was about to take a step forward and approach the platform, she suddenly realized that her body was completely immobilized, as if she was being bound tightly by invisible shackles. Right on the heels of that, pairs of illusory and wholly white wings appeared behind her as though they were passively resisting something. In the next second, on the pairs of angel wings, white feathers dropped as they fluttered. They grew deformed, thin, and fluffy limbs. The gaps in the layers of feathers spread open one after another as though they had become countless eyes. The deformed feathers immediately let out crisp laughter, causing a hollow chuckle to echo inside the mausoleum. All of them had come alive, turning into miniature, winged creatures. This reminded Bernadette of some fairy tales that her father had told her. There were always little pixies that weren't as big as a thumb in them. As this thought flashed through her mind, Bernadette felt her right eye itch. The eyelashes of that eye grew rapidly, turning into tiny arms that took root on her face, trying hard to pull her eyeball out. I see it. I see it. The veins in Bernadette's right eye protruded as they let out a childlike voice as though they had gained sentience and consciousness of her body. This was also a form of new life. Almost at the same time, Bernadette's left ear suddenly drooped down and covered her ears. "I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it," the ear shouted with a sharp voice. If she didn't use her spirituality, Bernadette would definitely imagine that she had a young maiden by her side, one that was covering her ears, stamping her feet, and screaming. Without cushioning anything, the sage frontlet in the middle of her forehead automatically left her body and floated into the air. The surface of the vertical eye embedded with diamonds instantly flashed with countless cold beams of light. It was as though numerous tiny eyes had grown out of it. Each eye reflected Bernadette. The sage frontlet had also obtained a certain living characteristic. Just as the Grade 0 sealed artifact was about to awaken and affect its target, a pale white, slender, illusory palm reached out and grabbed it. The sage frontlet's living characteristic rapidly dispersed, as though it had reached the end of its life. The ice-cold and pale hand that clearly belonged to a woman came from behind Bernadette. At some point in time, a figure with only an upper body appeared. This figure grew out of Bernadette's back. It was almost transparent and rather illusory. She was wearing the same clothing as Bernadette, and she was wearing the same feather triangular hat. Her blue eyes were like the projection of the ocean. It was like Bernadette herself, a part of her spirit that had drilled out of her body. However, there was a pale white face mask on Bernadette's half-body phantom. The mask only had holes where one's eyes were with no other gaps elsewhere. This made Bernadette's phantom appear extremely cold and noble, but it lacked the aura of a living being. This was the third item she possessed, and also her last Grade 0 sealed artifact. It was an item made after Emperor Roselle returned from the southern continent in his later years, called Pale Death. Its negative effect was to make the wearer slowly die until it became a corpse and become its slave. At this moment, Bernadette had used this point to restrain the abnormal life growing in her. Just as the half-body phantom appeared, her right eye quelled. Her eyelashes, which had turned thicker and longer into arms, began to fall off one by one. Her ears didn't make any noises either. They slowly opened and returned to normal. Without such a suppression, Bernadette's facial features, arms, and legs would have broken apart to seek freedom. After stabilizing her body, Bernadette tried to take a step forward. However, she was still unable to do anything. All she could do was control the half-bodied spirit body. After some thought, she made the spirit body behind her take out a ritual silver dagger from her pocket. Then, bending down, it drew a circle in the middle of her right boot. With a ripping sound, the leather boot quickly shortened by half. Then, Bernadette used her half-body spirit body to tear her pants near her left knee. She cut off a corner of her coat and blouse, removing one of the feathers on the side of her triangular hat. This attempt didn't seem to have anything to do with supernatural beings. It was just like a willful and rebellious girl who wanted to dress up in a different way from the normal sense of aesthetics. However, as Bernadette completed this series of actions, she carefully took a step forward. Her body could actually move, as she no longer felt restrained. The invisible suppression effect vanished instantly. The Black Emperor Mausoleum seemed to accept Bernadette in this form. Who would have thought that something an ordinary person could do was able to deal with such abnormalities? Furthermore, Bernadette suspected that the more she used her beyond her powers to resist whatever she was facing, the deeper the effects. This was because she had the feeling that she was facing an invisible deity. Only by pleasing the other party's sense of aesthetics could she be pardoned. Otherwise, she could only rely on the authority of a sequence 0 to circle around it. In addition, the lucky thing was that Bernadette wasn't once a knowledgeable mysticologist, but she also had a deep understanding of the Black Emperor pathway. She knew what the authorities this domain consisted of. She knew that it represented the shadow of order, a distortion of order. That was why Bernadette twisted the normal order around her using her dressing, thus, obtaining the recognition and acceptance of the invisible deity. Yes, in the matter regarding mysticism, knowledge and ideas are more useful than abilities at times. In that situation just now, any resistance would have been viewed as a provocation towards the internal order of the mausoleum, triggering unpredictable and terrifying changes. Once one figures out the crux of the problem, the negative effects will be easily resolved. Klein nodded above the gray fog and learned quite a lot from Queen Mystic. Although he was already a sequence higher than her, to the point of being a king of angels inside Sapphira Castle and having experienced quite a number of major events, his growth had been too fast. He was still lacking when it came to the details in problems. Now was the perfect time to make up for the deficiency through observation. After taking a step, Bernadette began to follow her spiritual intuition and walk toward the huge, empty chair on the platform. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. Suddenly, a breeze blew past her neck. This cold wind made Bernadette's body turn numb. At that moment, she felt a black shadow appear behind her. Silently, her long chestnut-colored hair parted, revealing a pair of eyes on her scalp. It was a pair of eyes without any eyelashes. They were almost transparent, cold, and heartless. Eyes of mystery prying. The pair of eyes turned slightly and saw that the shadow-like curtain in the mysterious world showed clear signs of distortion. However, it didn't notice the shadow, nor did it find the source of the cold wind. Just as Bernadette attempted to close the eyes of mystery prior and lower the possibility of an accident, the cold and sinister breeze suddenly appeared in her mind. Her thoughts became active as she became increasingly out of control. She was unable to direct her thoughts in the required manner. This seemed to be a trend that couldn't be changed, one that led to chaos. Without any hesitation, Bernadette grabbed the few seconds of thought she was capable of. She let the half-body spirit on her back remove the pale white mask. Then, she put pale death on her face, while the half-body spirit retracted into her body and fused with her. From this second onwards, Bernadette's thoughts would gradually die along with her body. However, her thoughts could not help but stir and turn chaotic. Both of these conflicting conditions offset one another, forming a weak and delicate balance that helped Bernadette regain her ability to think. To Bernadette, compared to the beyonder effects of pale death itself, its negative effects were even more effective at this moment. Maintaining the balance, Bernadette took a few steps forward. During this process, she always felt that there were shadows hovering around her, but she couldn't find them no matter how hard she tried. After thinking for a few seconds, Bernadette's blue eyes darkened once again, losing focus. She tried prophesying the consequences of her choice. Soon, a corresponding scene appeared before her eyes. After putting on the sage frontlet again, she once again transformed into pure and complicated information streams, using it to circumvent the obstruction and head to the high platform in the middle. However, just as she approached, the flood of information suddenly disintegrated. It lost its order and formed several Bernadettes built on different tenets. There was a young girl in a layered dress, a tall young girl, a melancholic and confused girl, a woman with a twisted and pained expression, and a calm and determined queen. The prophetic vision instantly disappeared and Bernadette's eyes instantly regained focus. At this moment, she saw the black shadow. It was standing right in front of her, no more than a fist away from her. That face formed from pure shadow completely occupied her vision. Chapter 1305 That black shadow. The moment Bernadette saw the black shadow, she instinctively clenched her right hand and conjured an ancient spear. From the tip of the spear to its handle, it was dyed with crimson-red balls. It emitted a strong destructive aura, as though it could harm a true deity. Spear of Longinus. This spear had once appeared in an ancient era that couldn't be traced back, stained with the blood of a great existence. At this moment, it had descended into the Black Emperor's mausoleum through mystical reenactment. However, when Bernadette thrust it forward, she failed to achieve any effects because the tip of the spear was directed at her back. Despite wanting to attack the black shadow in front of her, the spear of Longinus had strangely thrust backward. The area had been affected by a disorder, or suffered some form of distortion. Above the gray fog in the palace, Klein noticed the black shadow when it appeared in front of Bernadette. He didn't hesitate to raise the staff of the stars in his hand. He didn't wait this time, unlike his prior observations of Queen Mystic's actions before, where he would consider if he would provide her with protection. This was because the level of danger of the black shadow sounded off alarms within him. He was an angel of the seer pathway after all. More importantly, Bernadette could sense the shadow's existence after entering the Black Emperor's mausoleum from time to time. As for Klein, he was unable to find clues through the true vision provided by Sapphira Castle. This undoubtedly meant danger and terror. When all the gems embedded in the black cane lit up, the sound of melodious bells resounded in the area where Bernadette and the black shadow were. Gong! The bell that came from an infinite distance exuded an indescribable emptiness. It made the interior of the Black Emperor's mausoleum visibly freeze, turning Bernadette's figure stiff as if she had been frozen. She couldn't do anything. However, the black shadow didn't sink into the vortex of time. As though situated in another world built with completely different fundamental rules, the shadow continued moving forward in between the contradictory of two rivers of fate, one filled with raging torrents and one that was almost completely still. This only made it appear to slow down, in no way affected by the illusory bell. This was the first time Klein had encountered such a situation after he gained the ability to replicate powers. Although the Beyonder effects he had replicated with the Staff of the Stars were lacking compared to the original version, it would still be able to show a certain level of authority that wasn't easy to ignore regardless. However, the Black Shadow's slow movements gave him a second chance to try again. This time, he activated the Staff of the Stars' powers and moved Queen Mystic out of the Black Emperor's mausoleum. He wanted her to first conclude what she experienced before considering entering again. Gems flashed on the tip of the staff, and Bernadette, who was almost about to make contact with the Black Shadow, disappeared into thin air. In the next second, she appeared tens of meters away, appearing near the high platform in the mausoleum. The Staff of the Stars' teleportation was disrupted. The destination had been distorted, turning everything extremely chaotic. The experienced Bernadette didn't feel any fear or panic because she was stuck inside the Black Emperor mausoleum. She decisively raised her left hand and pressed the sage frontlet in the middle of her forehead as she used her fingers to stroke the pale death mask. The shimmering golden mask suddenly became soft and rapidly squirmed as if it was about to form a face that didn't belong to Bernadette. The face had soft features and obvious characteristics of a southern continent native, but it exuded a bizarre and terrifying feeling. Anyone who witnessed it would believe that it would come alive once the face became clear enough, an entity that came from ancient times, the eternal darkness where the dead slumbered. By then, Bernadette's body, spirituality, and consciousness would all belong to this face. With the protrusion of this face, the stone walls and floor tiles in the Black Emperor mausoleum began to weather. It happened so fast that thousands of years appeared to be washed away in a short span of 2 seconds. They quickly became mottled, constantly dropping fragments or throwing up dust due to the wind. In between the cracks, thin white fur grew out. In just the blink of an eye, the fur grew into white feathers, and their surface seemed to be soaked in light yellow oil. The aura of the black figure gradually weakened, as though it was running towards death with huge strides. Its color faded away, its movements growing slower. Within the area where the pale white mask was, even the concept of death itself would weather away and dissipate. However, what was labeled as death wasn't the end point. When the stone wall and the floor tiles in the mausoleum were weathered to a certain extent, and when the black figure degraded to a certain stage, new stone blocks began to take form as ethereal auras quickly grew. During this process, the black figure stretched out his right hand. This palm that was formed from shadows suddenly grabbed Bernadette's neck from dozens of meters away. This wasn't fulfilled by extending the arm, but distorting the concept of distance for an instant. 45 meters became equivalent to 45 centimeters. The dark palm didn't exert too much strength, but it made Bernadette feel cold. Under such coldness, she realized that she couldn't use the 2 Grade 0 sealed artifacts of the Sage Frontlet and Pale Death. Typically, as long as she injected her spirituality into it and gave the corresponding thoughts, the sealed artifacts on her would react in the correct manner, creating different effects. But now, the silent process and rules had been disrupted and distorted. No amount of thoughts that Bernadette willed were able to stir the sealed artifacts. It felt like she was speaking to the air. Klein, who was above the gray fog, didn't waste any time after failing to teleport Queen Mystic away. A series of complicated symbols and magic labels quickly formed in his mind. He wanted to replicate a secret sorcerer's space concealment. He planned on separating Bernadette's location from the Black Emperor's mausoleum and concealing it to help Queen Mystic escape her current predicament. In fact, it might be more appropriate replicating the fairy tale magic, Peace Blossom source, but considering how Bernadette was formerly a mysticologist, Klein felt that it was better to use space concealment. Otherwise, it might expose some of the fool's secrets. As for where he had learned space concealment from, it naturally came from the recently advanced furs. Previously, in the name of the World Gehrman Sparrow, Klein had rented Laymanos Travels. He had also requested Miss Magician to record the corresponding powers. Then, he released and recorded it while summoning the complete Laymanos Travels from the fog of history again and again. It didn't take long for him to grasp the knowledge and technique, allowing him to replicate spatial concealment. As more gems lit up on the staff of the stars, the area around Bernadette darkened, as though it was covered by a curtain weaved by shadows. The curtain distorted as it concealed the space, isolating the black shadow and its palm outside. This helped Bernadette regain her freedom. In the next second, the black palm that had been forcefully separated reached forward again and touched the boundary of the concealed space. In an instant, a transparent vortex-like door appeared in the abnormal void. Or rather, the secret door that originally existed appeared autonomously and opened up in front of the black palm. All concealed space had a door, but the location of the door depended on the creator's thoughts. The palm formed by the shadows rapidly passed through the open door and entered the concealed space. It grabbed Bernadette's neck and once again disrupted the connection between Queen Mystic and her sealed artifact, distorting the corresponding order. At the same time, the black figure raised its head and looked at the top of the mausoleum. It seemed to be studying Sapphira Castle and Klein through layers of space and fog. Klein's eyelids twitched instinctively. He sensed that the shadow had a certain understanding of where he was and felt that it was distorting something. Klein's expression unknowingly turned abnormally heavy. The different gems on the staff of the stars lit up at the same time. He wanted to attempt to steal the corresponding beyonder powers of the other party. Only by doing so would he have the chance to restrict the black shadow. And in order to increase the success rate of stealing his target's powers, Klein turned his left palm and tapped the edge of the long model table. However, his theft failed. He didn't even get anything. His target had long since escaped the lock-on, despite just standing there. Klein's gaze froze. Then, he saw the black figure flash and enter the concealed space, closing the distance between it and Bernadette. It distorted my true vision, causing the situation I saw to be from 1 or even 2 seconds ago. A thought flashed through Klein's mind as he made a preliminary judgment on the previous failure. He then decided to summon Will Septon's historical projection to get him to reboot the area. At that moment, Bernadette, who was unable to use her sealed artifact, grew white, illusory swan feathers on her back. This was her fairy tale magic's ugly duckling. It could make Bernadette reveal an incomplete mythical creature form while maintaining her clarity of mind. She could use it twice a day, with each use lasting 15 seconds. At this moment, her thoughts went wild again. They started to boil and become more chaotic. This caused her ugly duckling magic to be cut off before it could even show its effects. Almost at the same time, she saw the black shadow stick to her body. It was sticky like a viscous, corrosive liquid that seeped into her body. Bernadette's eyes darkened as she suddenly sensed something. She grabbed the final moment of lucidity and opened her mouth slightly, speaking in a fluent Chinese accent. Home, the black shadow's infiltration paused for a moment. Its upper body slowly rose as it looked at Bernadette. Chapter 1306 Seal. The black figure froze as it released its grip on Bernadette's neck. It was as though it was staring at Queen Mystic with its non-existent eyes. A dry, hoarse voice echoed in the concealed space. home, this voice was filled with hesitation and confusion as though it was seeking confirmation. It was as if it had come from another world. The corrosion that Bernadette encountered vanished. Her connection with the sealed artifact was instantly restored. Pale death once again ate at her vitality little by little. This helped her resist the chaos in her thoughts, maintaining her basic clarity and rationality. Just as she was about to say something, the black figure suddenly stretched out its palm. But this time, it didn't strangle Bernadette's neck, but instead, it pushed her hard. Following this push was the collapse of the concealed space. It was a voice filled with pain as though it was resisting something. "Leave." As the voice echoed, the black figure vanished. In an instant, it appeared on the huge, black, high-backed chair in the middle of the platform. 2 cracks appeared on its face, as though 2 asymmetrical eyes had grown out. However, the eyes didn't have any pupils. It was blood-colored. Right on the heels of that, another crack appeared beneath the 2 eyes. They too were filled with a pure, blood-red light. This allowed the black figure to finally open its mouth. It faced Bernadette as obvious sounds of pain resounded around it as though it was resisting something. "Leave this place." After being pushed out more than 10 meters away, Bernadette easily found her footing. However, she didn't follow the voice's order by leaving the Black Emperor's mausoleum. She stood there, staring blankly at the central platform. As she looked at the black figure, her expression revealed an unspeakable sadness. She could sense and now confirm that the black figure was her father, the man who called himself Caesar, Roselle Gustave. In the next second, more cracks appeared on the black figure's body. They ruptured from top to bottom, blooming blood-red flowers in different parts of his body. This made Roselle look like he was left with a shadow that wrapped around a blood-red object that emitted pure light. When Klein saw this scene above the gray fog, he naturally thought of the crimson moon high in the sky. At that moment, Roselle seemed to have transformed into a shadow. He wanted to block the crimson moon, but openings ruptured from his body, allowing more and more moonlight to shine into the real world. When these openings were connected together, the black shadow would completely split apart and give birth to a brand new crimson moon. When that happened, something extremely terrifying would definitely happen. At that moment, Roselle's black figure turned much more illusory, as though it had become an illusion. This made him look like he had been isolated in another world. There was an invisible barrier between him and the real world. Then, Roselle raised his right arm with great difficulty and pinched his forehead. The frequency at which blood-red cracks appeared on his body instantly decreased to a nadir. However, the eyes that had already appeared blinked repeatedly. However, this didn't bring any negative effects on the surroundings. It was as though it was just a simple change of order. The new growth of blood-red cracks was constantly being distorted to its original state of only having gradual activity. After completing this, Roselle raised his head and looked at Bernadette, who was dozens of meters away. He said with a hoarse voice, "You really have become an important figure in the mysterious world. You managed to come here alone. Come over, let me see how my little princess has grown." Bernadette's eyes reddened as she took a step forward. Roselle laughed again. "Back when I made sketchbooks, textbooks, and invented all kinds of small games for you, you were just a tiny midget. Now, you're able to save your poor old father. I remember that you liked the clothes I designed for you when you were young. Unfortunately, you can't wear layered dresses after you're an adult," the emperor rambled on, as if he had arrived in his twilight years and was someone who enjoyed reminiscing about the beautiful past. Bernadette walked faster and faster. Above the gray fog, Klein frowned indiscernibly. Suddenly, Emperor Roselle lowered his head and said with great force, "Stop." His voice carried an indescribable pain. Bernadette was stunned for a moment before she slowed down and stopped. She looked at the dark figure and her eyes gradually revealed an indescribable sadness. Roselle raised his head again and coughed lightly. "Didn't you really want to ask why the Black Emperor's mausoleum has to be engraved with the order one implemented and the style that one ushered? In fact, this wasn't necessary. I just wanted to let anyone who sees it remember my greatness." Before he could finish his sentence, the Emperor gripped the armrest by his side tightly. He suppressed his voice and said in extreme pain, "Don't come near me. I've been corrupted." The sadness in Bernadette's eyes deepened. Her guess had finally been confirmed. At that moment, the red cracks on Roselle's face began to turn chaotic. They closed and opened randomly with no signs of having a unified will. The Emperor took the opportunity and straightened his body. He looked at Bernadette and shouted with great difficulty, "Seal me. Seal." Queen Mystic Bernadette repeated the word silently. Her blue eyes quickly turned moist as a faint mist enveloped them. Even though she had lived for many years and was no longer the little girl she had been in the past, she was still unable to contain her emotions. However, she didn't ask for the reason, nor did she hesitate. With just a slight struggle, she firmly raised her right hand and pressed it on the pale white metal mask. She calmly made a decision, just like how she had faced all the major events that happened on the element Dawn over the years. On the surface of pale death, the metal instantly turned soft as it reformed into a new face with two black eyes. In the deep black parts of the eye, white lines appeared, forming an extremely complicated and mysterious three-dimensional symbol. It was like a long feathered bird or a coiled feathered serpent. The symbol absorbed the surrounding light and quickly turned corporeal. Then, it separated from Bernadette's eyes and extended its body, before flying towards Roselle Gustave on the iron-black chair. Along the way, the strange symbol caused the surroundings to become increasingly dim. The floor tiles and stone walls suffered another round of weathering as if the deity in charge of death had passed the final judgment. The falling rubble and flying dust followed the corporeal symbol and came to Roselle's side. Then, they coiled around him, enveloping the illusory black figure that seemed to exist in another world. During this process, Roselle failed to control himself several times. He attempted to leave the iron-black chair, but he ended sitting back down. He didn't resist the seal that Bernadette had exerted on him. As the symbol fused with his figure, he immediately had a connection with pale death. He saw the illusory deity that lorded over the countless undead and the swollen body of a water ghost loitering in a dark river. Roselle's aura immediately vanished as the cracked red openings closed one after another. What awaited the Emperor was a quiet and peaceful sleep. As for the symbol, it was sealed within Roselle's body, constantly influencing him until pale death stopped responding. In the blink of an eye, several blood-red cracks appeared on Roselle's body again. After his aura declined to a nadir, it gradually began to glow as he fought back against the corporeal symbol. Klein, who was above the gray fog, sighed when he saw this. He clenched his fist and pressed it against his mouth. The curtain he draped around himself suddenly rose up, and the entire Sapphira castle boiled over, in an obvious manner. Silently, the aura of new life that Roselle had just obtained began to dissipate. After vanishing to a certain point, it gained new life once again. Then, it was affected by the pale death and continued to fade away. Using the power of the Attendant of Mysteries beyond her characteristic in Sapphira Castle, Klein directly grafted new life and death, and skipped the process in between. The corruption that Roselle suffered was no longer able to recover to the extent needed to break through the pale seal. Following that, Klein extended his right hand and used the power of Sapphira Castle to draw out the mysterious symbol behind the fool's high-back chair, the mysterious symbol made up of the pupilless eye and the contorted lines. The symbol absorbed the aura of Sapphira Castle and quickly turned corporeal. With a wave of Klein's wrist, it entered the prayer light representing Bernadette and landed on Roselle's black figure, fusing into his body. Every time that the grafting vanished, this symbol that was directly related to the Fool and Sapphira Castle would draw upon new powers and complete the degrafting process once more. As he constantly passed away and gained new life, Roselle's face, which seemed to be a pure shadow, obtained facial features. Then, he looked to the top of the mausoleum, as though he was looking into an infinite height. He then retracted his gaze and looked at Bernadette. He said with an abnormally weak voice, "This seal is good. I can sleep in peace." With that said, he frowned slightly as his tone changed. "Who taught you how to dress like this?" Bernadette felt a little lost as she listened. It was as if she had returned to her teenage years. At that time, when she had dressed up to the nines for a ball held by other nobles, Roselle would use a similar expression and a similar tone to pepper her with a series of questions. The mist in her eyes became obvious, and she could no longer control herself. She lowered her voice and shouted, "Daddy." Roselle's facial features immediately turned gentle before tensing up again. He sternly said, "Leave. And never return." Bernadette opened her mouth, wanting to say something, but her vision went black as though she could see the shadow of order. In the next second, she found herself back at the edge of the primitive island. Bernadette stared blankly at the mountain peak in the middle of the primitive island for a few seconds before slowly turning around and walking towards the sea. This time, she didn't stubbornly insist on walking straight without looking back. Every few steps she took, she would stop and turn back to take a look. Soon, she returned to the dawn and entered the captain's cabin. She opened the room that was specially used to hold her collection. At a glance, Bernadette saw books, stacks of textbooks, clothes, and skirts. She saw the chess game that few people in the world knew, and the neat pile of wooden block toys. She leaned against the wooden door, slowly curled up, and sat on the floor. She raised her head to look at the dark sky outside the captain's cabin and pinched her lips with her right thumb and index finger. She whistled a melodious tune. It was a gentle, sweet, and sad melody that could calm people down. As the melody echoed, water beads fell from Bernadette's face and dripped onto the floor. After an unknown period of time, the captain's cabin was filled with a suppressed whimper. "Daddy." Chapter 1307 Meeting in the middle of the primitive island, in the Black Emperor Mausoleum. After sending away Bernadette, Roselle didn't immediately fall into a deep sleep. He slowly raised his head and looked up once again into the infinite distance. Above the gray fog, Klein sighed silently. He put down the staff of the stars and grabbed a paper figurine before shaking it. With a smacking sound, the paper figurine rapidly thickened and expanded before flying into the translucent vortex formed from illusory mysterious symbols beside the fool's chair. Although Bernadette had already moved to the edge of the primitive island and Klein could no longer see the situation inside the Black Emperor Mausoleum through the prayer light. However, he could use the symbol of the fool that had merged with Roselle's figure to maintain a connection with the Emperor up to a certain extent. After the paper figurine passed through the slowly spinning vortex, it descended into the dim mausoleum which had an unknown light source. It then turned into a human in front of the central platform. This human's black hair and brown eyes were somewhat similar to Gehrman Sparrow's, but he didn't have clear-cut features. The lines weren't deep enough, and his bearing wasn't cold enough. There were also certain differences in his facial features. His chin and stomach had a small amount of fat induced by an indulgent society. It was Klein's original appearance as Zhou Mingrue, the Zhou Mingrue who had been hanging inside Sapphira Castle for thousands of years beside Roselle Huang Tao Gustave. Roselle wasn't surprised by his appearance. With one hand on the armrest, he leaned forward slightly and said, "You're here." "I'm here." Klein nodded indiscernibly. "You shouldn't be here." Roselle sighed. "I'm already here." Klein very naturally participated in completing the meme populated by a popular Chinese novel by Gu Long. Having completely confirmed the origins of the fellow in front of him, Roselle returned to his normal sitting posture, chuckling as he said, "I originally planned on asking where you're from to see there's any need for regional discrimination, but after some thought, there's no need for that. We're all anachronistic miserable wretches without a home." Without waiting for Klein's reply, the Emperor's voice sank as he asked, "You know the truth about the apocalypse?" "Yes." Klein nodded slightly. Roselle continued asking, "You know that this is Earth?" "Yes," Klein answered frankly. When Roselle heard that, he laughed self-deprecatingly. "You actually learned about it so early." "I only dared to confirm it after I went to the moon and saw the true appearance of this planet from high above." At this point, the Emperor sighed and said, "The moon is bizarre. I clearly felt terror, but I didn't even consider the possibility of being corrupted. Then, I became more and more extreme. However, I did occasionally gain a certain level of clarity from the views of people around me, but I didn't dare to write it in the diary in that state. I was afraid of exposing secrets and losing my final chance. I eventually decided to use all the groundwork I did previously to switch to the Black Emperor pathway. Apart from the impending apocalypse, with Sequence Zeros being the only ones capable of protecting the people they wish to protect, they can hide them in other planets in the vast universe and use the corresponding authorities to rebuild a set of order for humans to survive in desolate lands. I also saw the hope of escaping my corruption by using the Black Emperor's ability to resurrect. As long as I became a Sequence Zero Black Emperor and was truly killed after turning half crazy, I'd have the chance of resurrecting in the mausoleum or in the astral world. When that happened, what would return to me would be a pure uniqueness and 3 Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristics. I wouldn't be tainted at all, nor will I contain an uncontrollable madness. Speaking of which, I made use of the eternal blazing sun and the god of steam and machinery to a certain extent back then. But the horror of the great old ones far exceeded my imagination. Accompanying my revival was a new life of corruption. Perhaps only great old ones can resist great old ones. I could only terminate the revival process, and live such an ignoble existence in my final mausoleum to prevent the great old one from using my body to be born in the real world. That would have brought about a devastating disaster. Klein had long guessed Emperor Rosel's condition based on what he knew and what had just happened. He wasn't surprised at all as he calmly replied, "The one who corrupted you is called the Mother Goddess of Depravity. She has bewitched many believers as the embodiment of the primordial moon." The facial features that appeared faintly on Rosel's face immediately changed. He fell silent for a few seconds before saying, "I know the primordial moon, but I didn't know that her true honorific name is the Mother Goddess of Depravity. Now that I think about it, my discovery of Mr. Doerr's cry for help might not have been a coincidence." Upon hearing this, Klein was alarmed. He instantly recalled the situations happening off-island. He had some sort of premonition about what Emperor Rosel was about to say. Rosel laughed and sighed. "The biggest problem in the first half of my life was that I was too confident. I always had the feeling that I could reload a save file and redo things. I didn't pay enough attention to the details. Back then, Grimm was corrupted by the strange powers on this island. He returned here after dying and regained new life. Isn't this the influence of the primordial moon? After I finished all sorts of investigations and did the corresponding purifications, I felt that I was fine. But in fact, fate might have undergone a tiny change at that moment. This resulted in me encountering Mr. Doerr later, and was slowly guided to the moon by him. You can't blame Mr. Doerr. His condition might be worse than mine. Does the Emperor mean that he has been targeted by the Mother Goddess of Depravity the moment he discovered this primitive island?" Klein sighed. At that time, who would have thought that the problem would be so serious? Before Sequence 2, understanding the cosmos and the great old ones led to terrifying corruption. And without understanding it, one wouldn't be able to accurately determine how serious the problem or what kind of patchwork was needed subsequently when faced with certain situations. This made Rosel treat this primitive island as his secret base, thus not informing existences that had the right to understand the outer deities, great old ones, and cosmos. That's right. Rosel seemed to be very gratified that he had committed a mistake that almost anyone would make. He then said, "In that ancient and secretive organization, there was almost no mention of the great old ones or outer deities." At that moment, Rosel paused for a moment before saying, "You should have read my diary. You should know what the ancient and hidden organization represents." Klein nodded. "I know which organization it is referring to. I never expected that you wouldn't dare mention the name of his organization after having the level of a Sequence Zero. I have a nagging feeling that he isn't simple. He might have an understanding of the outer deities that far exceeds our imagination, so it's better to be more careful. After all, I'm not a complete Sequence Zero true god." After Rosel said this simple sentence, his brows suddenly furrowed. "How much of my diary did you read?" If the atmosphere wasn't that heavy and sorrowful, Klein would definitely find it irresistible to reply with, "The taste of a demoness ain't bad," as a way to tease his fellow earthling. Finally, he replied calmly, "Plenty." After saying the word, he casually added, "I even found a few cards of blasphemy." "Which ones?" Roselle blurted out. Klein controlled the paper figurine's expression from above the gray fog and said in a flat tone, "Black Emperor, Tyrant, Red Priest, and the Fool." "Phew," Roselle exhaled as the faint crease on his brows eased. "Thankfully, it's not the Demoness, the Moon, and the Mother card. You had to mention it yourself." Klein didn't respond as he looked at the Emperor without a change in expression. After Roselle said that, he realized something and hurriedly coughed. "Well, we've all watched live streams, so you should know very well how normal it is to cross-dress." As he spoke, he coughed again and sighed. "Which pathway are you from?" "Seer," Klein replied succinctly. Roselle immediately fell silent. After a few seconds, he said, "Unfortunately, if everything is fine and dandy, you should be responsible for pulling out a large-screen television and a game console from the historical void. We can chat while playing. That's a romantic dream of us men. Unfortunately, there's no electricity. I have to rely on you to invent it." Klein didn't voice out his thoughts. He maintained his tone and said, "I hope such a day will come." Then, he pulled the topic back on track. "I'm very curious why the card of blasphemy you created can't even be found by deities. Such a level of anti-divination and anti-prophecy is amazing." Roselle immediately chuckled. "It's because knowledge can bring power, and power can also bestow knowledge. This is the authority of a knowledge emperor. After I infused the potion formula of the 22 pathways with power, they naturally produced the convergence powers between Beyonder characteristics. They also gained anti-divination and anti-prophecy effects to a certain extent." And then, as he spoke, Roselle suddenly paused, as though he had sensed something amiss. After 1 or 2 seconds, he said in an ethereal voice, "The creation of the card of blasphemy was a year before I held the Black Emperor ritual. Back then, I had already suffered the corruption of the primordial moon, and I didn't have the corresponding realization most of the time. Why can the 22 cards not be found by deities?" Upon hearing this question above the gray fog, Klein's heart tightened as he felt his scalp tingle again. Without waiting for his response from the paper figurine, Roselle's voice suddenly raised, bringing with it an indescribable fear. "Don't gather the 22 cards. Be careful of the Mother card." These 2 sentences echoed in the deep interior of the Black Emperor mausoleum for a long time. 1. Something common in China. Instead of being racist, they look down on people from poorer regions. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.